Every fall, my search and rescue (SAR) team holds an annual campout. It's a chance for us to train, bond, and recharge in the outdoors. Over the years, these retreats became something I looked forward to, a mix of hard work, camaraderie, and the thrill of sharpening skills that might one day save a life. But one particular year stands out, not because of the training or the team, but because of what happened during a night session. To this day, it's the most unsettling experience I've ever had. We were running a nighttime training drill. My dog Brody, an Australian Shepherd mix trained for cadaver detection and man-trailing, was by my side. He was an incredible partner, sharp, focused, and always eager to work. The drill that night was a standard exercise, following a scent trail to simulate locating a missing person. The woods were dense, and the cool air carried the faint smell of decaying leaves. As we moved deeper into the darkness, Brody suddenly alerted. His posture changed, head low, tail wagging with purpose. He'd caught a scent, and whatever it was, he was locked in. The trail didn't match the direction of the exercise setup, but Brody was insistent, pulling hard on the lead. Trusting his instincts, I decided to follow. The terrain grew rough as we moved away from the designated training area. The ground was uneven, and the darkness pressed in, making it hard to navigate. Brody led me to a dried creek bed. The slick rocks beneath my boots made more treacherous by the dampness lingering from an earlier rain. I was moving cautiously, but one wrong step was all it took. I slipped. The fall happened so fast I barely had time to react. My feet shot out from under me, and I slid down the embankment, rocks tearing at my clothes and skin. Before I could stop myself, I went over the edge of a small cliff. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and a sharp pain flared in my side. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think. When I tried to breathe, pain stabbed through my ribs. I knew immediately something was wrong. Broken ribs, maybe worse. My head throbbed, and everything felt hazy. Reaching for my GPS unit, I activated the emergency alert. It was a direct line to our base camp, signaling that I needed help. Then, as I lay there trying to focus on breathing, I realized something chilling. Brody was gone. The silence was suffocating. I could hear my own labored breaths, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and the occasional creak of a tree shifting. Minutes dragged by, each one stretching endlessly. And then I heard it, footsteps. At first, I thought it was my team, responding to the alert. But the steps were hesitant, uneven. They didn't have the purposeful rhythm of a search team. I strained to see through the darkness, my heart pounding harder with every passing second. A man appeared at the edge of the creek bed. His face was hard to make out in the dim light, but there was something immediately unsettling about him. He stood there, watching me for what felt like an eternity before he finally spoke. He started talking about the area, his voice low and almost conversational, but the things he said sent a chill down my spine. He mentioned how people often ended up in the creek, how flash floods during hurricane season or storms could sweep them away. His words felt deliberate, like he was trying to unsettle me, or worse, remind me of how vulnerable I was. I tried to move, but the pain in my side flared again, and I stopped. I was trapped, unable to defend myself, completely at this man's mercy. He began looking for a way down into the creek, and panic surged through me. Then I heard it. Brody's distinctive talking, noises cut through the darkness. It was a mix of trills, barks, and the familiar aroo he used when he wanted me to hurry up. Relief flooded through me. Brody was close. The man froze, his head snapping toward the sound. For a moment, he seemed to hesitate. Then, out of the shadows, another figure appeared, a massive German shepherd named Ranger. He was one of our team's dogs, known for his gentle temperament. But in that moment, he was all business. Hackles raised, teeth bared, he growled and barked with a ferocity I'd never seen before. The man backed away, his hands raised slightly as if to placate the dog. Then Brody emerged, his posture mirroring Ranger's, his sharp barks echoing through the trees. It wasn't long before two of my teammates appeared. One was a former Marine officer, and the other had a background in professional MMA fighting. They moved quickly, assessing my condition and stabilizing me while keeping a wary eye on the stranger. The dogs never let up, their growls and barks a constant warning. The man stayed at the edge of the creek, watching silently as my teammates worked. He didn't try to approach again, but he didn't leave either. It wasn't until they secured me onto the backboard and called for the wheeled stretcher that he finally disappeared into the woods. The trek back to camp was excruciating. Every bump and jolt sent pain shooting through my side, but I was too shaken to care. All I could think about was how close I'd come to something far worse than broken ribs and a concussion. Back at camp, the team's medical staff checked me over before sending me to a rural hospital for further evaluation. The doctor confirmed what I already knew: 2 broken ribs and a concussion, but all I could think about was the man in the creek bed. Later, one of the nurses mentioned that the area we'd been training in had a history of assaults, both physical and sexual. The realization made my stomach turn. If Brody and Ranger hadn't shown up when they did, I might have been another statistic. We filed a report with the local authorities, but as far as I know, nothing ever came of it. To this day, I have no idea who that man was or what his intentions were. Brody has long since retired, and Ranger is nearing the end of his working years, but I owe them both more than I can put into words. I've had plenty of strange experiences during my time in SAR, but none as disturbing as that night. I still wonder what scent Brody was following that led us so far off course. The training wasn't set up in that direction, and there were no reports of missing persons in the area. Maybe it was nothing, or maybe it was something we were never meant to find. The Tetons have always held a pull for me, a mix of awe, fear, and fascination. Death Canyon Shelf wasn't my first high-altitude trek, but it was the first one that taught me how quickly nature can turn against you, even when you think you're prepared. The name itself felt like a challenge. Death Canyon. I laughed it off when we first planned the trip, thinking the drama of the name was just a ploy to draw hikers seeking thrills. But by the end, I understood it was an exaggeration. We set out late in the season, during one of the driest summers in years. The plan was ambitious but manageable. A multi-day trek through the Tetons, high above the treeline, with nights spent camping in exposed terrain that promised breathtaking views. My husband and I had done plenty of backcountry trips before, but nothing quite like this. The first day felt like a dream. The mountains stretched endlessly, their jagged peaks slicing into the blue sky. The air was crisp, the kind that makes you feel alive with every breath. Despite the dry conditions, there was still a wild beauty to the land. Yellowed grasses whispered in the breeze, and patches of stubborn wildflowers clung to life in shady spots. Streams marked boldly on our map turned out to be little more than dusty ribbons of rock, but we weren't too worried. We carried plenty of water, and our packs, though heavy, were manageable. By the second day, the weather began to shift. Clouds piled up on the horizon as we approached a high pass. My husband grew uneasy. He's always been the cautious one, and while I tried to reassure him, I could feel the tension creeping into my own thoughts. Above the treeline, there's no shelter, no safety net. Just you, your gear, and the hope that the weather holds. We pushed hard to clear the pass, my husband driving us forward at a pace that left me winded. His pack was heavier than mine, always is, because he insists on carrying most of the weight, but the heat was punishing. It must have been close to 90 degrees, the sun baking the rocky terrain around us. By the time we reached the top, he was pale and shaky. We kept scanning the map, searching for water, but every blue line we crossed was dry. Each disappointment felt heavier than the last. When he finally admitted he couldn't go any further without water, I knew it was serious. Leaving him there felt wrong, but I didn't see another option. I took the filter and his empty bottles and hurried ahead. The stream wasn't far, just under a mile, but the weight of the situation made it feel endless. When I finally heard the faint gurgle of water, relief washed over me. I crouched by the bank, filtering as quickly as I could. That's when I saw them. First, just ahead, brown, round, and alert. Then another, and another. My stomach dropped. A grizzly and her cubs, not 20 feet away, across the stream. My mind raced. I knew what to do, but knowing and doing are two different things when fear grips you. Slowly, I stood up, arms wide, voice steady but loud. Hey there. Easy. I'm not a threat. The bear's eyes locked onto me, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then she gathered her cubs and moved away, not hurried, not panicked, just purposeful. It was over in seconds, but my hands shook as I finished filtering the water. The hike back to my husband was a blur. Every rustle in the brush set my heart racing, but I forced myself to keep moving. He was sitting right where I'd left him, his face lighting up when he saw the bottles in my hand. I didn't tell him about the bear until much later. There didn't seem to be a point in adding to his worry. That night, we set up camp on the Death Canyon Shelf. The name felt heavier now, less like a joke and more like a warning. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the wind picked up, carrying with it a biting chill. Clouds rolled in fast, their edges flickering with lightning. Thunder snow. I'd heard of it, but experiencing it was something else entirely. The storm swept in with a fury, lightning illuminating the tent so brightly it felt like daylight. The air reeked of ozone, sharp and metallic. We crouched in the tent, trying to minimize our contact with the ground, our breaths shallow and quick. Every boom of thunder seemed to shake the earth, and the sound of snow pelting the tent added to the chaos. At some point, I noticed the light outside had changed. For a moment, panic surged. I thought it might be a fire. But when I unzipped the tent, I found a world transformed. For inches of snow had fallen in what felt like no time at all. The landscape was unrecognizable, the sharp edges of the mountains softened by the sudden blanket of white. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving a silence so profound it felt almost oppressive. We stayed awake for hours, too wired to sleep, until exhaustion finally won. The next day, we packed up and started our descent. The snow melted quickly under the morning sun, turning the trails into a slippery mess. My legs ached, my nerves were frayed, but the views were still stunning. We thought the worst was behind us, but the mountains weren't done with us yet. That afternoon, a sudden hailstorm caught us off guard. Marble-sized chunks of ice pelted us as we scrambled for cover, our jackets doing little to stop the sting. By the time it ended, we were soaked and shivering. Hypothermia was a real risk, but we managed to get a fire going once we reached a more sheltered spot. By the time we made it back to the trailhead, I felt like we'd been through a gauntlet. Bears, storms, dehydration, hail. It was like the mountains were testing us, throwing every challenge they could our way. And yet, as we loaded our packs into the car and looked back at the peaks one last time, all I could think about was how beautiful it had been. The fear, the discomfort, the close calls, they were all part of the experience. The Tetons don't coddle you. They demand respect, they push you to your limits, but they also reward you in ways few other places can. It was the best trip of my life. Terrifying, yes, but unforgettable in every way. As we drove away, I found myself already planning our next adventure, because some places just have a way of calling you back. In 2018, I joined a backpacking group for a multi-day trip in North Carolina. The itinerary promised breathtaking views, challenging hikes, and the camaraderie of fellow adventurers. By the third day, I was tired but exhilarated. The kind of tired that makes your legs ache in the best way, knowing you've earned the views and moments shared with strangers who, by now, felt like friends. That morning, we made our way up Pilot Mountain. Not the larger, iconic Pilot Mountain that everyone seems to think of, but the smaller one, less famous, but no less impressive in its rugged beauty. The climb was steep, but the view from the top was worth every ounce of effort. We stopped to take photos, snack on trail mix, and soak in the vast expanse of rolling green hills below. The air was cool, crisp, and just beginning to hint at the colder temperatures that would come as the day waned. Around noon, we began our descent. The trail was rocky and uneven, forcing us to watch every step. I was pacing myself, feeling good despite the weight of my pack pressing into my shoulders. About halfway down, I felt an odd sensation, a brief moment of dizziness, like the world tilted slightly. I stopped to steady myself, assuming it was just fatigue or dehydration. Then, everything hit at once. The dizziness surged into a wave of vertigo, so intense it knocked me off balance. My stomach churned violently, and I barely had time to drop my pack before I collapsed, retching uncontrollably. The world around me spun, trees and rocks blurring into a nauseating whirl. I tried to sit up, but the effort sent another surge of nausea through me, leaving me trembling and disoriented. My group huddled around, their concerned faces blurry as I fought to focus. One of the guides crouched beside me, asking questions I could barely register. How was I feeling? Could I move? Could I eat or drink? The answer to all of them was no. Every attempt to sip water ended with me vomiting again, my body rejecting even the smallest effort to recover. An hour passed this way. The guide kept a close eye on me, while the rest of the group milled around, unsure of what to do. It was clear I couldn't hike out, and with the sun inching lower in the sky, the guide made a decision. He told the others to continue down to camp while he stayed with me, radioing for help. The rescue team would need time to reach us, and there was no guarantee how long it would take. The temperature was dropping. What had been a mild day in the 50s or 60s was now cooling rapidly, and the forecast warned it would plunge into the teens by nightfall. As I lay on the cold ground, shivering uncontrollably, the guide did his best to keep me warm, draping an emergency blanket over me and encouraging me to stay as still as possible. But my body wasn't cooperating. The relentless vomiting left me weak and dehydrated, and without the ability to hold down fluids, my condition was worsening. When the EMT finally arrived, it was a small relief. He assessed my condition quickly, his face grim as he called in for N4. The fluid would rehydrate me, but it also carried a chilling downside. The 4 bag was cold, and with my body already struggling to retain heat, it only made me feel colder. I could feel my limbs growing numb, my breathing shallow as the hours dragged on. Meanwhile, the rescue team was working to cut a trail up to us. The path was too steep and rugged for a stretcher to be carried down safely, so they had to chainsaw through the dense forest to create a workable route. Progress was agonizingly slow. The sound of chainsaws echoed faintly through the trees, each buzz a reminder of how far away help still was. As darkness fell, the guide and EMT debated their next move. My condition wasn't improving, and the dropping temperature posed a real danger. They made the call to request a helicopter. It would take time to get one on standby, but if the rescue team couldn't reach us soon, it might be my only chance. Finally, around 9 p.m., the rescue crew arrived. I remember the relief I felt when I saw the first headlamp bobbing through the darkness. They moved quickly, stabilizing me on a stretcher and wrapping me in additional blankets. Every jolt as they carried me down the newly cut trail sent sharp pain through my body, but I was too exhausted to care. Eventually, we reached a point where they could transfer me to an ATV. The ride was rough, bouncing over rocks and roots, but it was faster than carrying me by hand. By the time we reached the ambulance, I was barely conscious, the combination of cold, dehydration, and exhaustion overwhelming me. The hospital was a blur. They ran tests, CT scans, heart checks, trying to rule out anything life-threatening. When everything came back clear, they discharged me. It was 3 a.m., and I was still too weak to stand or walk. I remember sitting there, stunned, as they explained that I could call a cab, but would need to figure out where to go on my own. That's when a nurse took pity on me. She quietly led me to an empty room, where she brought me water, snacks, and a blanket. She stayed with me until morning, checking in periodically to make sure I was okay. Her kindness was a lifeline in that moment, a reminder that even in the worst situations, there are people who care. The next morning, my backpacking group came back for me. Seeing their faces filled me with a sense of gratitude I can't quite put into words. So many people had worked to save my life that day. The guide who stayed with me, the EMT who kept me stable, the rescue team who braved the dark and cold to reach me, and the nurse who gave me a place to rest when I had nowhere else to go. It's been years since that trip, but I still think about it often. About how quickly things can go wrong, even when you think you're prepared. About how fragile our bodies are, and how much we rely on others in moments of crisis. And most of all, about the strength of the human spirit. The way strangers come together in the face of adversity, each doing their part to ensure someone else makes it through. I haven't been back to Pilot Mountain since, but one day I'd like to. Not to relive the fear or the pain, but to stand at the top again and remind myself how far I've come. In my years working as a consultant to the Provincial Forestry Service, I'd been in plenty of dangerous situations, but none of them prepared me for that day. My role was to map fire line fuel loads in ash pits, using an infrared and LiDAR-equipped drone to provide critical data on fire activity. It was a job that demanded precision, focus, and a high tolerance for risk, especially when operating near active fires. But no amount of experience could make you completely immune to the fear that came with it. The plan that morning was straightforward enough. I'd be airlifted to a point above the active fire, deploy my equipment, map the fire, and then signal the helicopter to pick me up. This had become a routine over the last few days, and while routine might sound like a stretch when describing jumping out of a helicopter onto precarious ridges, it had started to feel manageable. The helicopter would perform a toe-in landing, hovering with just the tip of one skid on the edge of a rocky outcrop. I'd jump out quickly, try to avoid breaking a leg, and then catch my 70-pound equipment case before it rolled off the ledge. Not exactly comfortable, but it worked. That morning, though, I had a bad feeling. The kind of unease you can't explain, but also can't ignore. Maybe it was the way the fire had behaved overnight, aggressive, consuming everything in its path, leaving the air thick with smoke and ash. Maybe it was the way the winds had picked up, erratic and unpredictable, carrying embers high into the sky and dropping them miles away. Or maybe it was just the fact that I was a 60-year-old cancer survivor and partial amputee, trying to keep pace with a job that felt increasingly unforgiving. The helicopter dropped me off on what I can only describe as a knife's edge, a 2-foot-wide ridgeline with sheer drops on either side. Below me, the entire face of the mountain was ablaze, flames roaring like an ocean in a storm. The heat was intense, even from that height, and the smoke stung my eyes and throat. I set up my drone and began flying the mapping route, trying to ignore the rising sense of dread in my chest. Every movement felt precarious, like one wrong step could send me tumbling down the mountain. Once the mapping was complete, I packed up the equipment and radioed the helicopter for pickup. I could hear it approaching, the sound of the rotors cutting through the thick smoke, but I couldn't see it. Minutes passed as the helicopter circled, trying to find me through the haze. Then the radio crackled. The pilot couldn't see either the original drop point or the alternate landing zone. The smoke was too thick, visibility too poor. They told me I'd have to hike down to the northeast, where the fire wasn't as bad. As bad turned out to be a relative term. I looked down the slope in the direction they'd indicated. The fire had consumed much of the vegetation, leaving charred stumps and smoldering debris in its wake. Flames still licked at the trees further down, and the ground was littered with ash pits, hidden pockets of intense heat that could burn straight through boots if you weren't careful. And then there was the matter of the 70 pounds of equipment I had to carry with me. At that moment, a single thought crossed my mind. I am too old for this shit. But there was no choice. The helicopter couldn't get to me, and staying put wasn't an option. The fire was advancing, and the ridge offered no protection. So I slung the heavy case over my shoulder and began the descent. Every step was a battle. The slope was steep and treacherous, the ground shifting under my boots as I navigated through loose rocks and charred debris. The heat was unbearable, and the smoke made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. I stumbled often, my balance thrown off by the weight of the equipment. More than once, I felt the searing pain of burning embers landing on my arms or back, forcing me to drop to the ground and roll in the dirt to put out the flames. The sound of the fire was constant, an ominous roar punctuated by the sharp crack of falling trees. I was hyper-aware of my surroundings, scanning for anything that might signal danger. A tree about to topple, a patch of ground that looked too unstable, a sudden shift in the wind that could send flames racing in my direction. Despite my efforts, there were close calls. A tree fell mere feet away from me at one point, the impact sending a shockwave through the ground and scattering burning branches in every direction. I barely managed to dodge the debris, my heart pounding as I pressed on. Hours passed this way. My clothes were soaked with sweat, and every breath felt like inhaling sandpaper. My legs ached from the constant strain, and the weight of the equipment seemed to double with every step. I lost track of how many times I had to stop and drop to the ground, extinguishing small fires on my sleeves or pant legs. At one point, I stumbled into an ash pit, the heat burning through the soles of my boots before I managed to scramble free. I began to wonder if I'd make it out at all. The fire was unpredictable, and I had no way of knowing if the path ahead would lead to safety or trap me in an inferno. But giving up wasn't an option. So I kept moving, one agonizing step at a time. Eventually, I heard voices, faint at first, then growing louder. A team of firefighters emerged from the smoke, their faces smudged with soot and their gear battered from the battle against the flames. Relief washed over me as they approached, taking the equipment from my hands and guiding me down the remaining stretch of the mountain. We reached a safe landing zone where the helicopter was waiting. I don't think I've ever been so grateful to see those spinning rotors. The firefighters helped me into the chopper, and as we lifted off, I looked down at the burning landscape below. The scale of the destruction was staggering, but all I could think about was how close I'd come to being part of it. I spent the next 2 days in the hospital, treated for smoke inhalation and dozens of burns. The doctors were amazed I'd managed to make it out at all, given the conditions. As I lay in that hospital bed, replaying the events in my mind, I made a decision. I was done. I wouldn't map another forest fire. I'd had my fill of near-death experiences, and it was time to step away. I walked away from that job with a newfound respect for the men and women who fight wildfires. They face those conditions every day, risking their lives to protect others. They are some of the bravest, most selfless people I've ever met. As for me, I'll always carry the scars, both physical and emotional, from that day. But I also carry the knowledge that, even in the most desperate moments, the human spirit is capable of incredible resilience. The forest had always been a sanctuary for me, a place to escape the noise of the world and find a kind of peace that only comes with being surrounded by untamed wilderness. I'd camped in all kinds of conditions: torrential rain, biting cold, suffocating heat. I'd dealt with plenty of challenges out there, from hypothermia to stubborn bears rummaging around my campsite. But nothing could have prepared me for the night of the derecho in West Virginia. For those unfamiliar, a derecho is a freak of nature, an immense wall of wind that moves faster than you'd think possible, uprooting trees, flipping cars, and occasionally flattening small buildings. When you're out in the woods surrounded by towering trees, it's more than unnerving, it's downright terrifying. That night, though, the windstorm wasn't the only thing that made my heart pound. I had set up camp earlier that day in what I thought was a relatively secure spot. It wasn't exactly traditional camping. My tent was inside a single-walled pavilion, the kind of thing you might find at a state park picnic area, with a cement floor and a roof overhead. Not exactly cozy, but it was protection against the rain and gave me a false sense of security. I remember thinking, at least I won't have to worry about trees falling directly on me. The forest was thick here, dense enough that the idea of trees coming down was a constant background concern. The day had been humid, the air heavy with the kind of oppressive heat that makes every movement feel like a chore. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened ominously, a clear warning of the storm to come. I'd heard about the derecho in weather reports before heading out, but I underestimated just how violent it could be. As night fell, the wind started picking up, pushing through the trees in bursts that sounded like far-off trains. By the time the derecho hit, it was chaos. The wind screamed through the forest, shaking the pavilion and making me question whether the roof above me would hold. Branches snapped like gunshots, and the sound of falling trees echoed in every direction. The rain came down in sheets, so heavy that it felt like being caught in a waterfall. The temperature dropped sharply, and I could feel the cold seeping through my clothes despite the effort I'd made to layer up. I sat huddled in my tent, trying to ignore the groans of the pavilion's wooden supports when I first heard it. A low huffing sound, unmistakable in the silence that followed a particularly strong gust of wind. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks on my ears. But then came the sound of claws, clack, 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 against the cement floor. My stomach dropped as the realization hit me. I wasn't alone under the pavilion. The black bear had found its way into the structure, seeking the same shelter I had. It must have been panicked by the storm, confused and angry, and now it was pacing. I could hear it circling my tent, its claws tapping rhythmically on the concrete. The sound was almost hypnotic. Tap, tap, tap. It was accompanied by its heavy breathing, a series of loud huffs and grunts that made my blood run cold. I'd encountered black bears before. Usually, they were more scared of me than I was of them. A few loud shouts, maybe some banging on a pot or a stick, and they'd take off running. This bear, though, was different. It wasn't acting out of curiosity or hunger. It was agitated, frantic, and seemed just as trapped as I was. I shouted, trying to scare it off. My voice sounded small and weak against the roar of the wind. The bear didn't retreat. If anything, my yelling seemed to irritate it more. It began moving faster, circling closer to the tent. Every now and then it would stop, sniff the air, and then resume its frantic pacing. The storm outside only added to the terror. Gale-force winds ripped through the trees, the sound of snapping branches and crashing trunks constant now. Rain pelted the pavilion roof, so loud it felt like the storm was right on top of me. And through it all, the bear kept pacing, its claws clacking against the cement, its huffs and grunts growing louder. I knew I couldn't stay in the tent indefinitely. If the bear decided to investigate further or charge, I'd have no time to react. I grabbed my hunting knife from my pack, my hands trembling as I duct-taped the handle to my palm. The thought of having to defend myself against the bear was horrifying, but I wanted to be ready for the worst. Minutes turned into hours as I sat there, my heart pounding with every sound. The bear would leave the pavilion for a few moments, only to return just as suddenly. Each time it came back, it seemed more agitated, its pacing more frantic. I could picture it out there, its dark shape moving in the storm, its eyes reflecting the dim light from my headlamp. At one point, I heard a massive crash outside, another tree falling, somewhere nearby. The bear let out a startled roar, its frustration evident. For a moment, I thought it might leave for good. But no, the sound of its claws returned, tapping out an uneven rhythm as it circled again. By now, my nerves were shot. The storm, the bear, the cold, it was all too much. I felt trapped, completely powerless against the forces of nature and the unpredictable behavior of the animal just a few feet away. Finally, as the winds began to die down in the early hours of the morning, the bear seemed to lose interest. It stopped pacing, huffed one last time, and lumbered out of the pavilion. I listened intently, holding my breath, as its footsteps faded into the distance. I didn't move for what felt like an eternity. The storm was still raging, though less violently, and I was too shaken to do anything but sit there, clutching the knife taped to my hand. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a fitful sleep, my body curled into a tight ball inside the tent. When I woke, the storm had passed. The forest was eerily quiet, the aftermath of the derecho evident in the destruction around me. Trees were down everywhere, their roots torn from the ground. Branches littered the area, and the pavilion itself had sustained some damage, though it had held up better than I expected. There was no sign of the bear. I packed up my gear quickly, my hands still shaking as I worked. I didn't feel safe until I was back on the trail, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the pavilion. The walkout was sobering, a reminder of just how small and vulnerable we are in the face of nature's power. That night taught me a lot about fear, about patience, and about the importance of respecting the wild. It's an experience I'll never forget, and one that made me deeply appreciate the fragility of the barrier between us and the natural world. The Grand Canyon is a breathtaking place, a marvel of nature, a wonder that humbles you the moment you set foot near its edges. The colors, the vastness, the sheer depth of it all. It's the kind of place where you feel both awe and insignificance at the same time. We'd been planning the trip for months, hoping to instill a love of nature in our little girl, who at 3 years old was just starting to grasp the world around her. It was supposed to be an adventure, a fun bonding experience. Instead, it turned into the most terrifying day of my life. The day started off beautifully, the kind of clear, sunny morning you expect in the Arizona desert. Temperatures were already climbing, but we were prepared. We had plenty of water, sun hats, sunscreen, the works. Our campsite wasn't too far from the main area, but far enough that we felt surrounded by the quiet solitude of nature. The Grand Canyon loomed in the distance, its massive walls glowing in the morning sun. Our daughter was in a great mood, full of energy as usual. She had a mischievous streak, always loved playing little games, especially hide and seek. It was something I'd introduced to her months before, thinking it was a harmless way to keep her entertained. She loved the thrill of hiding, waiting for us to find her, giggling the whole time. At the time, I had no idea how that innocent game would haunt me. We'd spent the morning exploring a nearby trail, keeping things light since it was so hot. By noon, the sun was brutal, and we decided to head back to camp to rest. Our daughter had been walking with us, holding my hand, her little face red from exertion but smiling. She was babbling about the rocks and the birds, her tiny voice almost drowned out by the cicadas buzzing in the heat. When we got back to camp, I sat her down with a juice box and some snacks while my husband started organizing our gear. It was one of those moments where everything felt normal, almost mundane. I don't remember the exact second she vanished. It was that fast. One moment, she was there, sitting on the camp chair, sipping her juice. The next, the chair was empty, and my heart stopped. "Where is she?" I asked, my voice already rising. My husband looked up from what he was doing, confused. "She was just here," he said. We started calling her name. First calmly, then louder, more urgently. Maybe she wandered off to look at something, I thought, trying to tamp down the rising panic. But the longer it took, the more frantic we became. The campsite wasn't huge, and we combed it in minutes. No sign of her. I checked the van, my hands shaking as I opened the sliding door. "She's not here," I yelled, slamming the door shut and running to the next site. My husband was doing the same, calling her name, his voice echoing in the oppressive heat. The fear was like a living thing, growing with every second. My mind went to dark places. The Grand Canyon is vast, full of cliffs and drop-offs. What if she'd wandered too close to the edge? What if she'd fallen? Or what if someone had taken her? The possibilities were endless, each one more horrifying than the last. I could barely breathe as I ran from site to site, yelling her name, my voice cracking. Other campers joined in, their concerned faces blurring together as I tried to hold it together. My vision tunneled, and the world seemed to close in around me. The heat was oppressive, suffocating, and I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. My husband was the one who found her. I heard him shout, and for a moment, I didn't register what he was saying. Then it hit me, he'd found her. She was in the van I'd already checked. I ran back to him, my legs feeling like they were moving through molasses. There she was, our little girl, climbing out from under a pile of clothes in the back of the van. She looked up at us with wide, innocent eyes, completely unaware of the chaos she'd caused. It all came rushing at once. The relief, the guilt, the overwhelming flood of emotions that left me shaking and gasping for air. She'd been hiding, playing hide and seek, just like I'd taught her. She thought it was a game, but it wasn't a game. The van had been sitting in the sun all day. The temperature outside was over 100 degrees, and inside the van, it was even hotter. She could have died. I had closed the door, trapping her in that oven without even realizing it. The thought made me physically ill. We canceled the rest of the camping trip that day. There was no way we could stay after that. We packed up our things in silence, the weight of what had almost happened hanging heavy between us. My husband booked a cabin nearby, a place with air conditioning and solid walls, where we could regroup and try to process what had happened. That night, as I lay in bed watching my daughter sleep, I couldn't stop replaying it in my mind. The empty camp chair, the frantic search, the moment we found her, and the sickening realization of how close we'd come to losing her. In another universe, my husband didn't find her in time. I didn't check the van again. She stayed hidden under the clothes, and the heat did what it does. That thought will haunt me for the rest of my life. She's alive. She's okay. But that day changed me. I've never felt fear like that, the kind that grips your soul and refuses to let go. I learned how quickly things can go wrong, how a moment's distraction can turn into a nightmare. To this day, I can't look at that van without feeling a knot in my stomach. I've double-checked every door and every corner 100 times since then. I don't think I'll ever stop. I was 8 years younger, full of wanderlust and the thrill of discovery, when I set out on a road trip that would take me from southern Ontario down the eastern seaboard, through the southern U.S., and all the way to California. My car was packed with camping gear, a small cooler, a few maps, and the kind of confidence that only comes from experience in the woods. I'd spent years hiking and camping in Canada's mixed and boreal forests, where I knew the land like the back of my hand. I didn't think twice about stepping into unknown territory. I figured nature was nature. It's all the same once you're in it. That mindset, I now realize, was my first mistake. By the time I reached Utah, I'd already covered thousands of miles, and Bryce Canyon caught my attention. Pictures didn't do it justice. The red and orange hoodoos rose like ancient sentinels, their surreal shapes carved by time and weather. I was mesmerized and decided to camp there for a couple of nights to soak it all in. The desert environment was new to me, but I wasn't worried. I thought my experience would translate seamlessly. I arrived at the park mid-morning and secured a backcountry camping permit. The ranger on duty explained the rules and highlighted a few trails on the map. I nodded along, only half listening, eager to get out and explore. When he briefly mentioned flash floods as a risk, I didn't think much of it. Sure, I'd heard about them, but they felt like one of those rare, unlucky events that happen to other people. I was more focused on choosing a route that would give me good photo opportunities and solitude. I picked a trail that wound down into the canyon. The descent was breathtaking. The hoodoos towered around me, their deep red hues glowing in the sunlight. The air was dry, the kind of dryness that makes your throat scratchy if you don't sip water constantly. I hiked for hours, stopping often to take photos and just stand in awe of the landscape. It felt like walking on another planet, one stripped of its greenery and laid bare to reveal the raw beauty of the Earth's bones. I found a spot near the canyon floor to set up camp, a flat area sheltered by a few large rocks. It wasn't official, but I figured it was remote enough to avoid any issues. The sun was starting to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows that made the hoodoos look even more otherworldly. I cooked a quick meal on my portable stove, laid out my sleeping bag, and settled in for the night. The silence was deafening. Back home, the woods were alive at night, owls hooting, crickets chirping, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Here, there was nothing but an eerie stillness. It took me a while to fall asleep, my body unused to the quiet. The next morning, I woke up early, eager to explore more of the canyon. The day was overcast, but it didn't bother me. In the forests I was used to, overcast skies were just a sign of cooler weather, maybe light rain. I didn't think to check the forecast or question what rain might mean in this environment. I hiked deeper into the canyon, following a narrow trail that snaked along the floor. The rocks around me rose higher and higher, and I felt small, insignificant in the best way. I didn't notice the first drops of rain at first. They were so light, so sparse, that I thought it might have been my imagination. But then they came faster, heavier, soaking into my shirt and dripping off my hat. I cursed under my breath, annoyed that I hadn't brought my rain gear, but I wasn't too worried. Rain wasn't a big deal. Or so I thought. That's when I noticed the small trickle of water running across the trail in front of me. It hadn't been there before. At first, I thought it was interesting, a small, harmless stream forming right before my eyes. I kept walking, but the trickle quickly grew into a stream. Within minutes, it was a small river, flowing faster and faster. That's when it clicked. The ranger's words about flash floods came rushing back to me, and a cold pit formed in my stomach. The realization hit me hard. I wasn't in a forest with spongy soil and dense vegetation to slow the water down. I was in a canyon, surrounded by bare rock that funneled every drop of rain into one concentrated flow. The walls of the canyon were my prison, and I was standing at the bottom of what was quickly becoming a river. I didn't have time to panic. My instincts kicked in, and I turned around, heading back the way I'd come. The rain was coming down harder now, and the water was rising alarmingly fast. The once dry trail was now a slick, muddy mess, and every step felt precarious. My boots slid on the wet rock, and I had to use my hands to steady myself as I climbed. The water was up to my ankles, then my calves. It was moving so fast that I could feel it trying to pull me off balance. I kept climbing, my heart pounding in my chest. The slope was steep, and I had to scramble on all fours at some points, the mud caking my hands and knees. I could hear the water roaring behind me, getting louder and louder. I didn't dare look back. I knew if I hesitated, if I slipped, I might not get back up. Finally, I reached a ledge that was higher and wider. I collapsed onto it, gasping for air, my legs trembling from the effort. I looked back at the trail I just climbed, and my stomach dropped. The area where I'd been standing minutes ago was completely underwater. A raging torrent of muddy water filled the canyon floor, carrying rocks, debris, and anything else in its path. If I'd waited even a minute longer, I wouldn't have made it out. I sat there for a long time, watching the water rush by, too stunned to move. My mind was racing, replaying the events over and over. How close I'd come to being swept away. How my overconfidence had nearly cost me my life. The rain eventually stopped, and the floodwaters began to recede, but I stayed on that ledge until I was certain it was safe to move. When I finally made it back to my car, I was soaked, muddy, and shaken to my core. I didn't even bother changing out of my wet clothes. I just sat there for a while, staring at the canyon, trying to process what had just happened. It was a humbling experience, a stark reminder that nature doesn't care how experienced you think you are. It doesn't care about your plans or your confidence. It just is, and it's up to you to respect it. A few months later, I had another close call while hiking in Ontario's Algonquin Park. I was on a trail late in the season when two black bear cubs crossed in front of me, no more than 10 feet away. They didn't seem to notice me, but I knew better than to stick around. Where there are cubs, there's a mother, and surprising a bear with her cubs is one of the fastest ways to end up in serious trouble. I backed away slowly, my heart racing, and left the area as quickly and quietly as I could. These experiences changed the way I approach the outdoors. They taught me that no matter how prepared you think you are, there's always something you can't control. They taught me humility and respect for the natural world. And most of all, they taught me that survival isn't about strength or skill. It's about adaptability and the will to keep moving forward, even when the odds are against you. Camping alone in the wilderness had always been my way of escaping the chaos of life. There was something about being surrounded by nature, disconnected from the constant buzz of technology and people, that brought me peace. I had been to the Adirondacks several times before, but this trip was different. I wanted complete isolation, and I knew just the spot, a remote area deep in the forest, miles from any trailhead. It was perfect, or so I thought. The first day went smoothly. The drive to the trailhead was long but scenic, winding through dense woods and small mountain towns. Once I parked and loaded up my gear, it was a 2-hour hike to the campsite I had in mind. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy smell of fallen leaves and pine. By the time I reached the spot, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. I pitched my tent near a small creek, the gentle sound of water flowing over rocks adding to the serenity. I gathered some dry wood and started a fire, the flickering flames casting warm light against the encroaching darkness. Dinner was simple, a packet of freeze-dried pasta and a cup of hot tea. As I sat by the fire, watching the stars emerge in the clear night sky, I felt a sense of contentment. This was exactly what I had been looking for. The first night passed without incident. I slept soundly, lulled by the sounds of the creek and the occasional hoot of an owl. Morning came with a soft golden light filtering through the trees. After a quick breakfast, I spent the day exploring the area, snapping photos of the scenery and jotting down notes in my journal. I even found a small clearing with an incredible view of the mountains in the distance. As the second night approached, I felt a little more on edge. Maybe it was the increasing stillness of the woods or the way the shadows seemed darker and more oppressive, but I brushed it off as my imagination. I told myself I'd been watching too many documentaries about wilderness survival and predators. After dinner, I sat by the fire again, enjoying the crackling flames and the sharp chill in the air. That's when I felt it, the distinct, unnerving sensation of being watched. It wasn't a sound or a shadow, just a deep, primal feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced around the campsite, my eyes straining to pierce the darkness beyond the firelight. Nothing. Just trees and the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. Still, the feeling lingered. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was paranoia. After all, I was miles from the nearest trailhead, deep in a part of the forest that few people visited. The chances of someone else being out here were slim to none, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I eventually decided to call it a night. I doused the fire, making sure the embers were completely out, and climbed into my tent. I zipped it up tightly and settled into my sleeping bag, clutching my flashlight and a small hatchet I always carried when camping alone. Despite my unease, exhaustion eventually pulled me into a restless sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment, I couldn't figure out what had woken me. The fire was long dead, but the faint glow of the moon filtered through the thin fabric of the tent. The woods were eerily silent, the usual chorus of crickets and nocturnal creatures replaced by an oppressive stillness. Then I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps. They were faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. Someone, or something, was walking just outside my tent. My heart began to pound, the sound roaring in my ears. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then resumed, slow and measured, as if whoever it was knew exactly where they were going. I gripped the hatchet tightly, my palms slick with sweat. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The footsteps circled the tent, pausing every so often, as if the intruder was studying it, or me. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in terror. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to stretch and blur. At one point, the footsteps stopped completely, and I thought maybe whoever it was had left. But then, from the direction of the creek, I heard the faint crunch of leaves. They were still there. I debated what to do. Should I shout? Try to scare them off? What if it wasn't a person but an animal, like a bear or a mountain lion? What if shouting only provoked it? The thought paralyzed me further. The footsteps faded into the woods after a while, but I didn't dare move. I stayed in that same position, clutching the hatchet, until the first light of dawn seeped through the trees. When I finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent and step outside, my legs were stiff and shaky. The campsite looked undisturbed at first glance, but then I saw them, footprints in the dirt, circling my tent. They weren't animal tracks. They were human. I quickly packed up my gear, my eyes darting around the forest, half expecting to see someone watching me from the shadows. I didn't stop to eat or rest, just threw everything into my pack and started hiking back to the trailhead. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent my heart racing, but I didn't encounter anyone or anything on the way out. By the time I reached my car, I was drenched in sweat despite the cool morning air. I tossed my pack into the back seat, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. To this day, I have no idea who or what was out there with me that night. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was another camper who stumbled across my sight by accident, or a hunter passing through. But the deliberate, almost methodical way those footsteps circled my tent doesn't fit with either explanation. I haven't been back to that part of the Adirondacks since. Camping still brings me peace, but I stick to more populated areas now, places where I'm not completely alone. That feeling of being watched, of knowing someone was out there in the dark, still haunts me. It's a reminder that no matter how experienced you are, the wilderness holds dangers you can't always prepare for. Bryce Canyon had always been on my list of must-see places. The photos of its surreal, rocky spires, called hoodoos, were mesmerizing. I was used to camping and hiking in dense forests, but I wanted to try something new. Bryce Canyon, with its open desert-like terrain, seemed like the perfect challenge. So I packed my gear, jumped in my car, and headed for the famous canyon. I arrived on a sunny morning, the kind that fills you with confidence and energy. The air was dry, and the sky stretched endlessly overhead, a brilliant blue that made everything feel alive. After stopping at the visitor center for a map and some tips, I picked a trail that descended into the canyon and planned to camp near the bottom. It wasn't crowded, and the solitude felt refreshing. The descent was stunning. The hoodoos rose like jagged towers, their red and orange hues glowing in the sunlight. The trail twisted and turned, offering incredible views at every step. I felt like I was walking through another planet. By the time I reached the canyon floor, the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the landscape. I found a flat area to set up camp near a dry riverbed and pitched my tent. The first night was uneventful. I made a simple meal, wrote some notes in my journal, and enjoyed the peace of being so far from civilization. The stars overhead were brighter than I had ever seen, blanketing the sky like a sparkling ocean. The silence of the canyon was absolute, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the sparse bushes. The next morning, I woke up early, eager to explore. The weather had changed slightly overnight. Clouds were rolling in, and the air felt heavier. I wasn't too concerned. Back in the forests I was used to, clouds often meant a light drizzle at worst, and I figured the dry conditions in the canyon would soak up any rain quickly. I spent the day hiking around, marveling at the strange beauty of the rocks and the unique shapes carved by centuries of erosion. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed the clouds thickening, and a faint rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. I decided it was time to head back to camp. By the time I reached the canyon floor, the rain had started. At first, it was just a light drizzle, barely enough to dampen the ground. But within minutes, it turned into a steady downpour. I began to notice the dry riverbed near my camp filling with tiny streams of water, trickling down from the higher ground. That's when it hit me. I realized I was in a flash flood zone. The barren, rocky terrain of Bryce Canyon doesn't absorb water like the forests I was used to. Instead, rainwater flows rapidly downhill, collecting in the lowest parts of the canyon, the exact spot where I had set up camp. What had been a trickle at my feet quickly grew into a shallow stream. Panic set in. I knew I needed to get to higher ground immediately. Leaving my tent behind, I grabbed my backpack, which thankfully held my essentials: water, snacks, a flashlight, and a first aid kit, and started climbing the nearest slope. The rain was relentless, and the stream was now a rushing river, growing faster and deeper with each passing minute. The dry canyon floor I had admired earlier was disappearing beneath the water. As I climbed, the ground became slippery and unstable, the red clay turning to slick mud under my boots. Every step was a struggle. My heart was racing, and my breath came in short gasps. I could hear the roar of the water behind me, growing louder as the river swelled. Looking back, I saw my tent being swallowed by the rising flood. The sheer power of the water was terrifying, carrying debris, branches, rocks, and mud along with it. I focused on moving upward, clinging to roots and rocks to steady myself. But the slope was steep, and the rain made it nearly impossible to find solid footing. My hands were scraped and muddy, my legs trembling with the effort. At one point, I slipped and fell, sliding several feet before catching hold of a jagged rock. My palms stung, and I could feel blood mixing with the rainwater, but I didn't stop. I knew I had to keep climbing. The higher I went, the more treacherous the terrain became. The once dry canyon walls were now slick waterfalls, water pouring down in streams that made every step a gamble. I had to pause frequently, leaning against the rock to catch my breath and steady my nerves. Each time I stopped, I looked back at the river below, which had transformed into a raging torrent. Minutes felt like hours, and every muscle in my body burned with exhaustion. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and the temperature had dropped, adding to my misery. I was soaked to the bone, shivering uncontrollably. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached a small ledge that offered some stability. It wasn't exactly high ground, but it was far enough above the floodwaters to feel relatively safe. I collapsed onto the rocky surface, gasping for air and trying to process what had just happened. I stayed on that ledge for hours, watching as the flood raged below. The rain continued, but the water level eventually stopped rising. My tent and everything in it were gone, carried away by the river. I felt a pang of loss, but I was too grateful to be alive to dwell on it. As night fell, the rain finally began to ease. The floodwaters receded slowly, leaving behind a muddy, debris-strewn landscape. I knew I couldn't risk descending in the dark, so I huddled on the ledge, wrapping myself in the emergency blanket from my backpack. It wasn't much, but it kept me from freezing completely. When morning came, the canyon was unrecognizable. What had been a serene, dry landscape was now a chaotic mess of mud, rocks, and broken trees. The riverbed was still flowing, though much calmer than the night before. Carefully, I made my way down the slope, slipping and sliding on the muddy ground. I didn't bother looking for my tent or gear. The flood had swept everything away, and I knew it wasn't worth risking my life to search for it. My focus was on getting back to the trailhead and to safety. The hike out was grueling. Every step was a reminder of the previous night's ordeal, my muscles aching and my hands stinging from the cuts and scrapes. But as I climbed out of the canyon and onto the main trail, I felt a profound sense of relief. When I finally reached my car, I collapsed into the driver's seat, my body and mind utterly drained. I sat there for a long time, staring at the canyon in the distance. It was still beautiful, but now it held a different kind of power, a reminder of how quickly nature can turn against you, how fragile our place in the world really is. I never went back to Bryce Canyon after that trip. The memory of that night still lingers, a vivid reminder of my vulnerability and the raw, unpredictable force of nature. It taught me to respect the wilderness in a way I never had before, to never underestimate its ability to change in an instant. It wasn't just the flood that scared me. It was how close I had come to not making it out. That day, I truly understood what it meant to survive. It was late fall, and the air was crisp as I set out for a 3-day hike through Ontario's Algonquin Park. The trees were just past their peak colors, and the forest was quiet, with most of the summer crowds gone. This was the kind of solitude I craved, a chance to disconnect from the chaos of daily life and reconnect with nature. I had been hiking and camping for years, mostly in this part of the world. The dense boreal forests and countless lakes made it a perfect place for solitude. The trails were familiar to me, and I felt comfortable navigating the wild, even late in the season when the days were shorter and the nights colder. The first day was uneventful. I hiked along a well-marked trail, enjoying the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I set up camp near a lake, where the reflection of the setting sun painted the water in shades of orange and pink. The night was chilly but peaceful, the kind of calm that made you forget about the dangers of the wilderness. On the second day, I planned to cover more ground, following a loop that would eventually bring me back to the trailhead. The forest felt different that morning, quieter than usual. The only sounds were my boots on the trail and the occasional call of a distant bird. As the day wore on, the stillness began to feel almost oppressive. I shook it off, convincing myself it was just the solitude playing tricks on my mind. By late afternoon, I was deep in the forest, far from any road or other campers. The trail narrowed, winding through a dense section of pine trees. The air was colder here, and the shadows stretched long across the path. I was about 2 hours from my next planned campsite when I saw them. 2 black bear cubs. They were tiny, probably no more than a few months old, their glossy black fur standing out against the brown and yellow forest floor. They walked right across the trail in front of me, maybe 5 or 10 feet away. My first reaction was awe. They were adorable, clumsy little creatures, completely unaware of my presence. But awe quickly turned to dread. Where there are bear cubs, there is a mother bear. And a mother bear is not something you want to encounter in the wild, especially when her cubs are involved. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced through everything I knew about black bears. Unlike grizzlies, black bears were generally more skittish around humans, more likely to run away than attack. But a mother protecting her cubs was a completely different story. If she felt I was a threat, she wouldn't hesitate to charge. The cubs continued to toddle across the trail, disappearing into the bushes on the other side. I stood there, not daring to move, straining my ears for any sign of the mother bear. The forest was eerily silent, the kind of silence that feels alive, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. And then I heard it, a low, guttural huff, followed by the unmistakable sound of branches snapping. She was close. Panic surged through me. I looked around, trying to assess my options. Running was out of the question. Bears are fast, much faster than any human. Climbing a tree wasn't a good idea either. Black bears are excellent climbers. The best thing I could do was stay calm, make myself look as big as possible, and slowly back away. I took a deep breath, raised my arms above my head, and started speaking in a steady, firm voice. Easy now. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm just passing through. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the bushes where I had heard the sound. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to move deliberately, step by step. Every muscle in my body screamed to turn and run, but I knew that would be a death sentence. The huffing grew louder, closer. Through the dense underbrush, I caught a glimpse of her, a massive black bear, her dark eyes locked on me. She stepped onto the trail, her head low, her movements slow and deliberate. She wasn't charging, not yet, but her posture was clear. She saw me as a threat. I kept backing away, my voice steady, but my hands trembling. It's okay. I'm leaving. You can have the trail. She followed me, keeping a distance of about 20 feet, her eyes never leaving mine. Every step I took felt like a gamble. Would she decide I was too close? Would she charge? The tension was unbearable, a constant, gnawing fear that any second could be my last. After what felt like an eternity, I reached a bend in the trail. I moved around it, breaking her line of sight, and immediately picked up my pace. I didn't run, but I walked as fast as I could without making noise, my ears straining for any sound of pursuit. I didn't hear her following me, but I didn't stop. I kept moving until I was sure I had put enough distance between us. Only then did I allow myself to breathe, leaning against a tree as my legs threatened to give out. The sun was setting, and I knew I needed to find a safe place to camp, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there watching. Every shadow in the forest seemed to move, every rustle of leaves made my heart skip a beat. I finally found a small clearing and set up camp, my hands still shaking as I pitched the tent. I didn't build a fire. I didn't want to attract any more attention. Instead, I ate a cold meal and climbed into my sleeping bag, clutching my bear spray like a lifeline. That night was the longest of my life. Every sound outside the tent, every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, felt like a threat. I barely slept, my mind replaying the encounter over and over, imagining all the ways it could have gone wrong. By morning, the forest felt different again. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by the chirping of birds and the rustling of small animals. It was as if the danger had passed, as if the forest itself had decided to let me go. I packed up quickly, eager to put more distance between myself and the bear. The rest of the hike was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the lingering unease. Even when I reached the trailhead and saw my car waiting for me, I didn't feel completely safe until I was miles away from the park. That encounter changed the way I think about the wilderness. I had always respected nature, but this was different. It was a reminder of how small and vulnerable we are out there, how little control we really have. I still hike and camp, but I'm more cautious now. I carry bear spray on every trip, even in areas where bears are rare. And I never forget that feeling, the weight of her gaze, the sound of her huffing, the raw power of something that could end me in an instant. That day in Algonquin Park was a close call, one I'll never forget. It was a humbling experience, a reminder that the wilderness is not just a place of beauty and solitude, but also a place where survival is never guaranteed. Camping alone had never bothered me. I liked the solitude, the quiet, the feeling of being completely cut off from the world. Northeast Ohio had plenty of good spots for it. Deep woods, scattered lakes, and not too many people if you knew where to go. This trip was supposed to be a peaceful 3-day escape, just me, my hammock, and the woods. The first 2 nights had been perfect. Days spent hiking, fishing in a nearby creek, and cooking over a small fire. Nights spent swaying in my hammock, listening to the wind rustle through the trees. There had been no signs of people anywhere around me. That was why I chose this spot. Remote enough that I wouldn't have to deal with strangers, but close enough to a trailhead that I could pack out without too much hassle when the trip was over. But the third night, that was different. I woke up in the dead of night, groggy, my bladder screaming at me to get up. The air was cold, damp, the kind of chill that makes you think twice about leaving the warmth of your sleeping bag. But I had to go. I grabbed my headlamp from the ridge line above me, switched it on, and slid out of my hammock. My boots were sitting next to the tree I'd tied the hammock to, but I was too tired to put them on. I just walked a few steps into the brush in my thick wool socks. 10 feet, that was all. I unzipped and started pissing. That's when I saw it. A light. A headlamp, about 80 to 100 feet away. I froze midstream, my breath catching in my throat. The beam of light wasn't moving, just hovering there, pointed slightly downward. Someone was sitting out there in the dark, watching my campsite. I killed my headlamp immediately. My night vision was shot, but I didn't need to see to know something wasn't right. I stayed still, barely breathing, watching. The guy out there, he wasn't just standing. He sat down, stood up, sat back down, like he was waiting for something. The hairs on my arms stood up. I forced myself to move slowly, finishing up and stepping back toward my hammock, careful not to make any noise. I needed my boots, my hatchet. If this guy was just some lost hiker, he would have called out. He wouldn't just be sitting there in the dark, watching. I slipped my boots on without tying them and grabbed the hatchet I kept looped on my pack side pocket. I wasn't planning on swinging it at anybody, but I wasn't about to let myself be out here, alone, unarmed. I had 2 choices: stay put and wait, or go find out what the hell this guy was doing. I chose the second option. I kept low, moving to the right of my campsite, careful with every step. The last thing I wanted was to step on a branch and give myself away. The leaves were damp, and that worked to my advantage. I made it about 50 yards from my site, creeping closer to where I had seen the light. My eyes were finally adjusted to the dark now, and I could see the faint glow of his headlamp through the trees. I took another step forward. That's when I saw the second one. Another headlamp. This one was closer, maybe 40 feet away, and it was moving. A person, walking around slowly, scanning the ground with his light. I barely had time to think before I dropped straight to the ground, throwing a few leaves over myself in a quick, desperate attempt to blend in. The second guy walked closer. My heart was slamming in my chest. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. He got within 10 feet of me, close enough that I could hear his boots crunching over the ground, close enough that I could smell the cigarette smoke clinging to his clothes. He stopped, lit a cigarette, took a long drag, exhaled. Then he popped open a beer, took a few swigs, and just stood there. The glow from his cigarette was the only thing I could see clearly. I held my breath. If he turned his light on me, if he spotted me, hell, I didn't know what would happen. But the way these guys were acting, I knew it wouldn't be good. Minutes passed. He finished his beer, crushed the can in his hand, and tossed it to the ground. Then, finally, he moved away. I stayed put until I was sure he was gone. Then, slowly, I got up and started moving toward the first guy again. I got close enough to hear his phone, the soft buzz of messages coming in. His face glowed faintly in the dark from the screen's light. I took another step. That's when he stood up, and he started walking toward my hammock. I went completely still. I watched him move, slow and deliberate, toward my camp. I didn't follow. Not yet. I waited, crouched low to the ground, listening. Then I heard it. The sound of my tarp ripping. The clatter of my mess kit hitting the ground. Then voices. Where is he? He was just here. I stayed put, heart hammering against my ribs. I saw their flashlights swinging wildly through the trees, scanning, searching. I could hear them going through my stuff, kicking things over, tearing my campsite apart. And then I saw my own flashlight turn on. Click, click, click. They were messing with it, turning it on and off, flashing it through the woods. I didn't move. I just laid there, listening, waiting. My hands were clenched so tight around my hatchet that my fingers hurt. I didn't know what their plan was, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't about to walk back into that campsite. I watched as their flashlights started moving away, getting smaller, dimmer. I waited until I was sure they were gone before I even dared to breathe normally again. By the time the sun came up, I made my way back. My entire site was destroyed. My hammock was shredded, my tarp cut to ribbons, the nylon fabric slashed with what looked like a machete. My mess kit had been stomped flat. My backpack, rain gear, and flashlight, gone. I walked to where I had seen the first guy sitting. Empty beer cans, a few chew pouches, an old lighter. Then I went to where the second guy had been standing. Cigarette butts, an empty bag of powder, meth, by the look of it, and a pile of human shit. No toilet paper. I didn't pack up. There was nothing left to pack. I grabbed what little was salvageable, my boots, my hatchet, and I walked out. I don't know what those guys wanted. Maybe they were just tweaking, looking for something to mess with. Maybe they had worse intentions. I don't know. But I do know this. I haven't camped alone since. And I never will again. When you're 16, you don't think about consequences the way you should. You think you're invincible. You trust too easily, especially when you're trying to fit in with people older than you. I learned that the hard way. I wasn't particularly close with the group I went camping with. I had met one of the guys a handful of times. He was the older brother of a kid I kind of knew. The others were in their late teens or early 20s, adults in my eyes. When they invited me on a camping trip in rural Oregon, I jumped at the chance. It was supposed to be 2 nights, just a quick getaway before summer ended. The drive was long, the roads twisting through dense forests until they turned to gravel, then dirt. The farther we went, the rougher the terrain became. By the time we reached the campground, we were deep in the wilderness. There were no marked campsites, no other people, no signs of civilization. Just us, the trees, and a river running about 100 yards from where we set up camp. The first day was fine. We unpacked, set up our tents, and gathered wood for a fire. The guy who drove us, Adam, brought a cooler full of beer, which was mostly what the others were interested in. I wasn't much of a drinker, but I wanted to fit in, so I took a few sips of warm beer and pretended to enjoy it. The night was loud with laughter, music from a cheap battery-powered radio, and the crackling of the fire. The second day was different. It started with tension between Adam and his girlfriend, Sarah. I didn't know exactly what had happened, but I caught enough pieces of their arguments to understand that Adam thought Sarah was flirting with one of the other guys, Mike. By late afternoon, Adam was fuming, pacing around camp, snapping at anyone who spoke to him. Then, without a word, he got into his truck, slammed the door, and took off down the dirt road, leaving behind a spray of dust and gravel. At first, we thought he was just blowing off steam. Someone joked that he'd be back by nightfall, but as the hours passed, the laughter faded. By sunset, it was clear he wasn't coming back. We tried to push it out of our minds, tried to act like everything was fine. Someone had brought a fishing rod, so a couple of the guys went down to the river, hoping to catch something to supplement our dwindling food supply. The rest of us sat around the fire, pretending not to be worried. Night fell, and still no sign of Adam. We went to bed, telling ourselves that he'd be back in the morning, that he had probably just driven to the nearest town to cool off. Maybe he'd show up with more beer and act like nothing had happened. But morning came, and the truck never returned. By the time the sun was fully up, our situation was clear. We were stranded. No one had a phone. This was the early 2000s, and even if one of us had a cell, there was no chance of getting a signal this deep in the woods. We were at least 10 miles from the nearest paved road, maybe more. None of us knew the exact way back. Adam had been the only one who really knew where we were. Panic started to creep in. Breakfast was the last of our food, some granola bars and a couple of crushed bags of chips. Nobody wanted to admit it out loud, but we were screwed. Some of the guys wanted to hike out right away, to try and find the road. Others argued that it would be safer to stay put and wait. Maybe Adam had told someone where we were. Maybe help would come. So we waited. By nightfall, the fear set in. We were out of food. The firewood was running low. The sounds of the forest, which had seemed peaceful on the first night, now felt menacing. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the underbrush, made my stomach twist. The darkness felt endless. Sleep didn't come easy. I lay in my tent, staring up at the thin fabric above me, my stomach twisting with hunger and anxiety. The air was cold, damp, and filled with the sounds of the forest. Owls hooting, leaves rustling, distant howls that could have been coyotes. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard movement outside my tent. Not an animal, footsteps. I held my breath. The steps were slow, deliberate, moving around the camp. Then something brushed against my tent. I squeezed my eyes shut, too afraid to move. My mind raced. Was it someone from our group, restless, wandering around? Or was it something else? The sound of a zipper being pulled sent a jolt of fear through my body. Then, the footsteps retreated. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning came, and with it, a new wave of panic. The argument about whether to leave or stay flared up again, more desperate this time. Some of the group wanted to pack up and start walking. Others were too afraid of getting lost in the wilderness. The hunger was making it harder to think straight. Then, finally, salvation. A family arrived. They rolled in late in the morning, their car kicking up dust as it pulled into the clearing. A dad, a mom, and 2 kids. They looked surprised to see us, probably because this place was so remote. I will never forget the relief that flooded through me. After some frantic explanations, the dad agreed to drive a few of us to the nearest town. I was one of the first to pile into the car. I barely even looked back at the others as we pulled away. The drive felt like forever, but when we finally rolled into town and found a payphone, I knew we were safe. Calls were made, and within a few hours, people were on their way to get us. I never spoke to anyone from that trip again. I never wanted to. That experience changed me. It taught me that trust is fragile, that people will leave you behind without a second thought. And it taught me something else. The woods are indifferent. They don't care if you're lost, hungry, or scared. They will swallow you whole if you let them. Camping had always been something my partner and I loved. It was our escape. Every year, we went up to the same spot, a quiet and isolated area deep in the mountains. It wasn't a well-known location, which was what made it perfect. Most of the time, we'd only see 1 or 2 hunters or fishers miles away from where we set up camp. But this time, something felt different. It started when we arrived. The entire mountain was empty. Not a single other person in sight. That was strange, but not alarming, just something we noted. Usually, you'd expect at least 1 truck parked somewhere along the dirt road, some distant campfire smoke drifting into the sky, maybe even the faint sound of a rifle shot from a hunter in the distance. But nothing. The air was thick with an eerie silence. We brought my parents' elderly dog with us, like we did every year. He was a small thing, never much of a guard dog, but he liked the outdoors and usually spent most of the trip sniffing around, lounging by the fire, and curling up in the tent at night. He had never shown any fear or unease before. We set up camp in our usual spot, a small clearing surrounded by thick trees with a slight downward slope leading to a narrow creek. The routine was familiar: unloading the truck, setting up the tent, gathering firewood. The sun was still high when we finished, so we scouted the area like we always did, walking along the nearby trails to get a feel for our surroundings. We saw no signs of recent human activity. No footprints, no discarded fishing lines, no bullet casings. It was as if no one had been up here in months. As night fell, we settled around the fire, eating and drinking, enjoying the stillness of the wilderness. The only sounds were the occasional crackle of the fire, the chirping of crickets, and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like something is watching. Then the dog started acting strange. Normally, he would lay by our feet, content to soak in the warmth of the fire. But tonight, he was restless. His ears were perked, nose twitching. He kept staring toward the tree line, sniffing the air, his body tense. At first, we brushed it off. Maybe he smelled a rabbit or a raccoon. But as the night went on, his unease only grew. We climbed into the tent, leaving the mesh flap unzipped for ventilation. The air was warm, and we wanted to let the breeze in. But the dog refused to settle. He sat near the opening, staring out into the darkness, completely focused on something we couldn't see. His body was stiff, his breathing shallow. Then, without warning, he let out a deep, low growl. That was enough to make us get up and check. We grabbed a flashlight and scanned the tree line, but there was nothing. No movement, no glowing eyes reflecting in the light. Just trees and darkness. But the dog didn't relax. We decided to sit by the fire for a little while longer, thinking maybe it would calm him down. That's when he started snarling, his hackles raised, staring fixedly at the same spot in the woods. His growls turned into sharp, aggressive barks, the kind of sound a dog makes when it feels truly threatened. At this point, every hair on my body was standing on end. We weren't new to camping. We knew the dangers out here: bears, cougars, wolves. But the way the dog was reacting wasn't like anything we had seen before. It wasn't just alertness, it was full-blown fear. We grabbed our hunting knife and axe, listening intently. The silence was heavy, pressing down on us. Then, just as we started thinking we might be overreacting, we heard it. A branch snapping. It wasn't the sound of a small twig breaking underfoot. It was loud, heavy, like something big had stepped down hard, just a few feet beyond the glow of our fire. We froze. The dog went rigid, teeth bared, a deep snarl rumbling in his throat. Another snap. Closer this time. That was enough. We grabbed the dog and bolted for the truck. Slamming the doors shut, we locked them, sitting in the dark cab with our hearts pounding, eyes scanning the campsite. The fire still flickered, casting long, shifting shadows across the trees. But we couldn't see anything. We sat there for what felt like hours, muscles tense, barely breathing. The dog eventually curled up in the back seat, still alert but no longer growling. Whatever was out there had either moved on or was waiting. After what seemed like an eternity, we decided to step back outside, keeping the truck close. We repositioned ourselves in front of the fire, gripping our weapons tightly. For a while, nothing happened. The dog seemed calmer. Maybe it was gone. Then, another snap. But this time, it wasn't a branch. It was louder, sharper. The unmistakable sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush, only 10 feet away. We didn't hesitate. We grabbed the dog, jumped into the truck, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the campsite and the dense trees beyond. But there was nothing there. No movement, no glowing eyes, just emptiness. We drove, fast. The rough dirt road jostled the truck, but we didn't slow down. I kept glancing in the side mirror, half expecting to see something burst from the trees and chase us down the mountain. But nothing came. When we finally reached civilization, we felt the tension begin to lift, but the unease remained. We told my partner's parents what happened. They laughed, called us paranoid, mocked us for running away from the unknown. But we knew what we heard. Something was there, watching us, stalking us. Maybe it was a cougar, waiting for the right moment to strike. Maybe it was wolves, lurking just beyond the fire's glow, testing our defenses. Maybe it was something else, something that had no fear of humans, something that knew how to stay hidden. Whatever it was, we weren't going to wait around to find out. And we sure as hell weren't going back. Camping had always been one of my favorite things to do. There was something about being out in the woods, away from the noise of everyday life, that made me feel completely at peace. My best friend and I had been planning this trip for weeks. We were young, 17 and 18, but we'd both grown up around the outdoors, and we knew how to handle ourselves. We picked a campground that was a little off the beaten path, one we had been to before. It wasn't the kind of place you'd find packed with tourists or families with screaming kids. It was quiet, tucked away in a heavily wooded area with a small lake nearby. Most people stuck to the main camping spots closer to the entrance, but we decided to go farther back, where no one else had set up. We wanted privacy, and we got it, at least for a little while. We arrived in the afternoon, the sun still high, casting warm golden light through the trees. It was perfect. The air smelled fresh, a mix of pine and earth. Birds flitted between the branches, their songs the only sounds besides the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. Setting up was easy. We had a small tent, just big enough for the two of us. We arranged our sleeping bags inside, stacked our firewood, and placed the cooler by the fire pit. Everything felt calm and safe. It was exactly what we had wanted, a simple, peaceful night in the woods. For the first couple of hours, it was just us. We built a fire, cooked some food, and sat talking as the sky darkened, turning deep shades of orange and pink before fading to black. The stars came out, scattered thick across the sky. It was beautiful. Then, just as we were getting comfortable, we heard the low rumble of engines. Headlights cut through the trees as two massive trailers pulled into the campground. Not just near the entrance, but all the way to the back section, where we had thought we'd be alone. The quiet was gone in an instant. Doors banged open, voices erupted, men, women, children. It wasn't just a couple of people. It was full families, spilling out of the trailers like a flood. The sound of laughing, shouting and stomping filled the air. Kids ran wild, their high-pitched squeals bouncing off the trees. It wasn't just the noise that unsettled me. It was the way it changed the whole feel of the place. What had been peaceful and secluded was now crowded and chaotic. The quiet safety we had felt was gone. We tried to ignore it. We sat by our fire, talking in low voices, trying to pretend we weren't surrounded by strangers. But it was impossible. The adults were drinking, heavily. I could hear the clinking of bottles, the loud, slurred laughter, the way their voices got more aggressive as the night went on. Hours passed, and they didn't settle down. If anything, they got worse. We decided to call it a night, climbing into the tent and zipping ourselves inside. I laid there, listening to the muffled sounds of drunken conversations, bursts of laughter, the occasional shouted curse word. My friend was tense beside me, neither of us really able to relax. Finally, after what felt like forever, the noise started to die down. The voices became quieter, slurred mumbles instead of shouting. The occasional clinking of bottles faded. One by one, they started heading to bed. I let out a breath. Maybe now we'd actually get some sleep. Then I heard footsteps. Not quiet, careful steps, loud, uneven, heavy. Someone was walking right past our tent, close enough that I could hear their breathing. Then came the sound of a can hitting the fabric of our tent, a dull thunk that made my friend flinch. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. Someone had just thrown a beer can at us. The footsteps continued, circling around. I could hear more voices now, low and drunken. Then, suddenly, someone stomped down hard right next to the tent. "Roar, I'm a bear." The deep, slurred voice boomed through the thin fabric. Heavy stomps shook the ground. My friend clutched my arm, her breathing shallow. They were messing with us. Wasted and out of control. I laid completely still, barely breathing. The last thing I wanted was for them to know we were awake. Maybe if we didn't react, they'd get bored and leave. Another stomp. Another loud, exaggerated RAWR. I could smell the alcohol on them through the mesh. I didn't know what they wanted. Maybe they thought it was funny. Maybe they just wanted to scare us. But in that moment, I wasn't thinking about jokes. I was thinking about how we were two young girls alone in a tent, and there were grown men drunk off their asses just outside. Eventually, after what felt like forever, they wandered off, laughing to themselves. Their footsteps faded, and I finally let myself breathe again. Neither of us slept much after that. Every little sound made my skin crawl. Every crunch of leaves had my heart in my throat. I kept thinking about how easily things could go wrong. By the time the sun started to rise, I was exhausted but relieved. We got out of the tent, stretching stiff limbs, and started packing up. Over by the trailers, the adults were slowly waking up, groggy and hungover. I watched as one of the men, the same one who had stomped around our tent last night, tried to play frisbee with the kids, a beer still clutched in one hand. He stumbled, barely able to throw straight. They didn't even remember what they had done. They had spent the night being loud, obnoxious, and reckless, but we were the ones who had been nervous about getting in trouble. A couple of years later, the campground banned teens from camping alone, said we weren't responsible enough. But we had been quieter, more respectful, and more in control than any of those so-called adults. We never went back. I've always loved the outdoors. Camping, hiking, just being away from everything. It's always been something I looked forward to. The quiet, the fresh air, the feeling of being completely disconnected from the rest of the world. But sometimes, being alone in the wilderness isn't peaceful. Sometimes it's the most terrifying thing in the world. This happened a few years ago. I still think about it every time I go camping. I still feel that creeping unease when I hear certain sounds at night. I had decided to do a solo camping trip. It wasn't my first time camping alone. I knew how to handle myself. I was careful. I followed all the basic rules. Let someone know where I was going, packed enough supplies, made sure I had a way to get help if I needed it. I wasn't being reckless. The spot I picked was deep in a national forest, a place I had been to before. It wasn't a designated campground, just a clearing I had found off a dirt road a few miles from the main hiking trails. The kind of place where no one would just stumble upon you. That was the point. I wanted to be alone. I got there in the late afternoon, the sun still high in the sky. The place was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by dense trees, a little stream nearby, soft ground for the tent. No signs of other campers. No trash, no fire pits, nothing. Completely untouched. I set up quickly, pitching my tent, gathering firewood, making sure everything was in order before the sun started going down. The routine was familiar. The motions were comforting. I built a fire as the sky turned orange, cooked a simple meal, and sat back to enjoy the quiet. And it was quiet, not in a peaceful way, in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. There were no sounds of birds, no rustling in the bushes, no distant animal calls. Just silence. At first, I ignored it. The fire crackled. The warmth of it on my skin made me feel safe. I told myself the quiet was normal, that maybe the animals just weren't close by. Then I heard the first sound, a branch breaking. It wasn't loud, but in that silence, it might as well have been a gunshot. I froze, staring into the trees. Nothing moved. The firelight only reached so far, casting flickering shadows that made the forest seem even darker. I told myself it was an animal. A deer, maybe. A raccoon. Something small. But it wasn't just one sound. A few minutes later, another crack. Closer this time. Then another. Something was moving through the trees. Slowly. Deliberately. I felt my stomach tighten. I was used to the woods, used to the sounds of nature. This wasn't the random rustling of an animal foraging. This was different. I stood up, scanning the darkness. My flashlight was in the tent. I cursed myself for not keeping it closer. The fire wasn't enough to see beyond the immediate clearing. I grabbed the biggest piece of firewood I could find and threw it into the trees. It landed with a thud, breaking twigs, stirring up leaves. Then silence again. Whatever was out there, it had stopped moving. I sat back down, forcing myself to stay calm. My brain kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was nothing. I ate the rest of my food slowly, listening. My ears strained for any sound. Nothing. After a while, I started to relax again. The fire had burned down a bit, just glowing embers now. It was getting late. I decided to call it a night. I put out the fire, making sure it was completely dead. The darkness around me felt heavier without it. Inside the tent, I zipped myself in, checked my knife, my bear spray, my phone. No signal, of course. That was expected. I told myself I was being paranoid. I laid down, closed my eyes, forced myself to breathe slow and steady. I don't know how long I slept before the sound woke me up. It was close. Breathing. Right outside my tent. Not animal breathing. Not the sniffing of a curious raccoon or the huff of a passing deer. It was human. Slow, deep, steady. I stopped breathing. My body went completely still. My ears strained, every hair on my body standing up. The breathing didn't move. It just stayed there, right outside the thin layer of fabric separating me from whoever, or whatever, was out there. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. My heart pounded so hard I thought whoever was outside would hear it. I stayed like that, frozen, for what felt like hours. Then slowly the breathing changed. It became softer, fainter. Then it was gone. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just laid there, listening to the silence, waiting. Nothing. Minutes passed. Maybe an hour. My whole body ached from how tense I was. Finally, I forced myself to move. I didn't unzip the tent. Didn't make a sound. Just listened. Then footsteps. Soft, slow. Walking away. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I stayed there, knife in hand, heart pounding. When the first light of dawn finally crept through the trees, I unzipped the tent slowly, carefully. The clearing looked the same. Nothing out of place. No footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. But I knew. I packed up fast. Threw everything in my backpack, barely even taking the time to fold my tent properly. I didn't care. I just wanted to be gone. The walk back to my car was the longest I've ever done. Every sound made my skin crawl. I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me. But there was nothing. I made it to my car, threw my gear in the back, locked the doors the second I was inside. I sat there for a long time before starting the engine, hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles were white. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't know what they wanted, but I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone. I grew up spending a lot of time outdoors. My grandparents owned a huge stretch of land out in the middle of nowhere, miles of thick woods, old fields, and rolling hills. It was the kind of place where you could walk for hours and never see another person. It always felt wild, untouched, peaceful. Ever since I was a kid, I liked going out there alone. I'd find a spot, build a small shelter, and camp for the night. No tent, no real gear beyond what I could carry in a small pack. Just me, the trees, and the sounds of the woods. My dad had told me once that there had been an old farmstead somewhere nearby, but I never really thought much about it. I figured it was long gone, just a rumor. The land was empty now. No houses, no old barns, nothing left standing. Just trees and silence. One summer, I decided to head out for a night on my own. I had done it plenty of times before. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, just that I'd be back the next day. I had my knife, a small hatchet, some water, and a light blanket. That was all I needed. I hiked deep into the woods, further than usual. I wanted to find a new spot, somewhere untouched. It took a while, but I eventually found the perfect place. A small clearing nestled between a few tall trees. The ground was soft, covered in thick leaves. It felt right. I spent a few hours gathering branches, cutting small limbs, and weaving them together to make a half-face brush shelter. It was simple, just enough to block the wind and keep me hidden. Once it was done, I built a small fire, ate a little food, and sat back to enjoy the quiet. The woods at night are different. The sounds change. The air feels heavier. Even when you're used to it, there's always that little sliver of unease in the back of your mind. You feel watched, even when you know you're alone. But nothing happened that night. It was early morning when I started to wake up. The sun was just beginning to rise, the air still cool. I wasn't fully awake yet, just drifting in and out, my mind foggy. I had pulled my blanket over my face, just enough to block the light. It was thin, though. I could still see through it a little, just shadows and shapes. And that's when I saw them. Two figures standing just outside my shelter. I couldn't make out their faces, just the shape of them. Tall, motionless. The hats they wore were wide-brimmed, old-fashioned. Not cowboy hats, something older, like the kind settlers used to wear. They weren't moving, just standing there, staring. My body went cold. I stayed completely still, my breathing shallow. I told myself I was dreaming, that I was still half asleep. But something felt wrong. I could see the faint outline of their shoulders, the way their arms hung at their sides. Solid. Real. My heart started pounding. I didn't want to move, didn't want to breathe too loud. I lay there, frozen, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. Then, in a split second, I yanked the blanket down. Nothing. The clearing was empty. The trees stood silent. The air was still. I sat up fast, my hands shaking. I scanned the tree line, searching for any sign that someone had been there. Footsteps. Broken branches. Anything. There was nothing. Just the early morning light cutting through the trees. The same clearing I had fallen asleep in. I forced myself to calm down. It had to have been a dream, some leftover image from sleep bleeding into reality. That was the only thing that made sense. But I didn't feel right. I packed up fast, kicked dirt over the fire pit, grabbed my gear, and started hiking back. My skin felt tight, my stomach twisted. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something behind me. I never did. I made it back to my grandparents' house without issue. Didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't want to sound crazy. It was probably nothing. Just a dream. At least, that's what I tell myself. But I never camped in that part of the woods again. I've always loved solo camping. There's something about being completely alone in the woods that makes me feel free. No distractions, no noise from the world, just nature and me. I know a lot of people are scared of being alone in the woods, but I always felt comfortable. Until this trip. This was the first time I ever felt truly afraid out there. I had driven about 2 hours from the nearest town to a remote national forest. No official campsites, no trails, just deep woods. I parked my truck on the side of an old dirt road, grabbed my gear, and hiked in. I walked for over an hour, making sure I was far from any roads. I didn't want to run into anyone. That was the whole point, to be alone. After a while, I found a good spot. A small clearing next to a creek, surrounded by thick trees. It was perfect. I dropped my pack, took a deep breath, and smiled. This was exactly where I wanted to be. I got to work setting up my camp. First, I pitched my tent near the tree-line, where the ground was soft. Then, I gathered some dry wood and built a small fire pit. The sun was still high, but I liked getting everything ready early. After everything was set up, I took a quick walk around the area. I like to check my surroundings whenever I camp. It helps me get a feel for the land, and I also keep an eye out for anything unusual, old trails, animal tracks, anything that might tell me who or what comes through the area. Nothing seemed off, just a peaceful, untouched part of the forest. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. The air was cooling, and I decided it was time to start a fire. I struck a match, let the flames catch, and before long, I had a good fire going. I sat by the fire, cooked a simple meal, and listened to the sounds of the forest. Birds were settling in for the night, the wind rustled through the trees, and the creek bubbled softly nearby. It was peaceful, at least at first. At some point, as I sat by the fire, I got this weird feeling. I can't explain it, but I suddenly felt like I was being watched. I turned and scanned the trees, but there was nothing there. Just darkness beyond the firelight. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe I was just too aware of being alone. But the feeling didn't go away. I tried to ignore it. I focused on the fire, poked at the burning wood with a stick, listened to the sound of the flames. But every few minutes, I'd feel it again, that creeping sensation that someone was there. I finally stood up and grabbed my flashlight. I aimed it into the trees and slowly scanned the area. Nothing. Just trees and darkness. I exhaled, feeling silly. I was psyching myself out over nothing. Still, I couldn't shake that unease. I decided to call it a night. I put out the fire, climbed into my tent, and zipped it shut. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. The fire was out. The tent was completely dark. Everything was silent. But then I heard it. Crunch. A single step. Leaves shifting. Close. My body went stiff. Then another step. Crunch. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a raccoon or a deer. The steps were too heavy. Two-legged. Someone was walking around my tent. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. The footsteps moved slowly, circling my tent. Crunch. 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 Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They weren't even trying to be quiet. They wanted me to hear them. I held my breath. My mind raced. I knew I had two options: stay silent and wait or make a move. I chose to wait. I didn't want to let whoever it was know I was awake. The footsteps stopped. Right next to my tent. I could hear my own breathing. Shallow. Quiet. Then, after what felt like forever, the footsteps started again. But this time they moved away. Crunch. Crunch. Slow, steady steps. Fading into the trees. And then silence. I didn't move. I stayed awake for hours, gripping my knife, listening for any sound. Nothing. At some point, exhaustion won. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I opened my eyes, it was morning. Sunlight filtered through the trees. Birds chirped. Everything seemed normal. But I knew what I had heard. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, scanning the clearing. Everything looked the same. My pack was where I left it. My fire pit was cold. The creek still flowed peacefully. Then I noticed something. My firewood pile. I had stacked it messily the night before, just tossing sticks together. But now, it was neatly res-stacked, perfectly arranged, organized, like someone had been there. I stared at it for a long time. I wanted to believe I had done it and just forgotten. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. Someone had been there. I packed up my gear as fast as I could. I didn't waste time eating. I didn't even bother to fully take down my tent. I just stuffed it into my pack and left. I hiked back toward my truck, checking behind me every few minutes. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anything. But I felt it. I wasn't alone. Even after I got to my truck and drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling. I don't know who or what was out there that night, and I don't want to find out. I've been camping alone for years. But after that trip, something changed. I still go camping. I still love the woods. But now I'm always aware. I always listen. Because out there, in the middle of nowhere, you're never truly alone. Camping alone in the deep woods was something I had done many times before. I liked the peace and quiet, away from people, away from noise, away from everything. It was something I had gotten used to, something that felt almost like a ritual. I would pack my bag, drive as far as I could, then hike deeper into the forest until I found the perfect spot. That night was no different. I had chosen a small clearing by a slow-moving creek. The trees stood tall and thick around the edges, their dark silhouettes blending into the night sky. The place felt secluded, untouched. Exactly how I liked it. By the time I set up my tent and gathered some firewood, the sun was already sinking below the trees. I built a fire, its orange glow flickering against the trunks, sending long shadows stretching across the ground. The sound of the creek nearby was steady and calming, a soft background noise that filled the silence. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, ate slowly, and watched as the flames danced in the cool night air. The woods around me were alive with the usual sounds: crickets chirping, the occasional rustle of a small animal moving through the underbrush, the hoot of an owl somewhere in the distance. It was peaceful. After a while, I felt tired. I put out most of the fire, leaving only a few glowing embers, then crawled into my tent. Lying on my sleeping bag, I listened to the sounds of the night, letting them lull me to sleep. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Not the quick, light movements of a deer or the scurrying of a raccoon. Two-legged. Human. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The steps were coming from just beyond my tent, moving through the undergrowth. The crunch of leaves. The snap of a twig. Each sound deliberate, controlled, careful. I strained to hear more, my heart hammering. The steps circled my tent. I reached slowly for the knife I always kept nearby, my fingers wrapping around the handle. I held my breath, waiting, listening. The footsteps moved again, closer. Then they stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that feels too heavy, too thick. The crickets had gone quiet. The usual rustling of the night had stilled. It was just me and the sound of my own breathing. I wanted to look. I wanted to unzip the tent and shine my flashlight outside. But I didn't. Something about this felt wrong. I lay there, gripping my knife, my muscles tense. Then nothing. Minutes passed. Maybe an hour. I wasn't sure. I kept listening, waiting for something, anything. But the footsteps didn't come back. Eventually, exhaustion took over. My body was too tired to stay awake, even with fear pressing down on me. I don't remember falling asleep, but at some point I must have. I woke up to the first light of dawn filtering through the tent. Birds were singing again, the normal morning sounds of the forest returning. For a moment, I just lay there, my mind foggy with sleep. Then I remembered. The footsteps. I sat up quickly, unzipped my tent, and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp and cool, the sky tinged with the soft colors of sunrise. Everything looked normal, but something felt off. I walked around the tent, scanning the ground. The leaves and dirt were disturbed, but not in a way that showed clear footprints. Whoever, or whatever, had been there had moved carefully. Then I saw it. My pile of firewood. I had stacked it neatly the night before, leaving it beside the fire pit. Now it was restacked. Neater. Tighter. As if someone had taken the time to adjust it. I stared at it for a long time, my stomach twisting. Why? Why would someone come to my camp in the middle of the night, walk around my tent, and then fix my firewood pile? I felt exposed, like I had been watched. I didn't waste any more time. I packed up my gear quickly, shoving everything into my backpack with shaking hands. I put out the remaining embers of my fire, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started hiking back the way I had come. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I don't know who, or what, was out there that night, and I don't think I ever want to find out. There was a kind of peace that came with being deep in the woods, far from everything. No noise, no stress, no people, just me, my tent, and the wild. That's why I picked a remote spot in northern Montana, far from any roads or established campsites. It was late September, the kind of time when the air was crisp but not too cold, and the trees were turning beautiful shades of red and orange. I had hiked in earlier that morning, following an old trail that was barely used. The nearest road was at least 15 miles away, and I hadn't seen another soul all day. By the time I set up camp near a small clearing, the sun was already low in the sky. The place was perfect, flat ground, a good spot for my tent, and plenty of wood nearby for a fire. I spent the rest of the daylight hours collecting firewood, making sure I had enough to last through the night. When darkness fell, I lit the fire and cooked a simple meal, some canned beans and a few strips of beef jerky. I ate slowly, enjoying the silence, the way the fire crackled and sent little sparks up into the night sky. It felt good to be out there, completely alone. Or so I thought. It must have been around 9:30 p.m. when I first noticed it. I was leaning back in my camping chair, staring into the fire, when I had this sudden feeling that I wasn't alone. It was the kind of feeling that creeps up on you, like the air around you has changed, like something is watching. I looked up and scanned the tree line. At first, I saw nothing. Just dark trees, their leaves rustling slightly in the wind. But then, just beyond the reach of my firelight, I saw it. A figure. A man. He was standing completely still at the edge of the trees, just far enough away that I couldn't make out any details. But he was there, I was sure of it. I sat up straight, my heart suddenly pounding. "Hello," I called out, my voice steady but cautious. No response. The figure didn't move. He just stood there, watching. I reached for my flashlight, my fingers fumbling a little as I clicked it on and pointed it toward the trees. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but the moment it hit the spot where the figure had been, he was gone. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, the way the shadows played against the trees. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I poked at the fire, making the flames jump higher, pushing back the darkness as much as I could. I sat there for a long time, listening, waiting. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I was just spooked by the isolation. Maybe I was just tired. I decided to stay up a little longer, just in case. An hour passed. Maybe 2. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and I was starting to feel the weight of sleep pulling at me. The woods were silent, except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Then, just as I was about to call it a night, I saw it again. Movement. This time, the figure was closer. He was crouched low behind a fallen log, maybe 10 feet from me. His body was just barely visible in the dim light from the fire. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed my flashlight again and aimed it at the log. Nothing. The space where he had been was empty. Just dirt, leaves, and the old rotting log. But I knew what I had seen. I swallowed hard, my heart hammering. Something wasn't right. Someone was out there, watching me, moving closer. I stood up, gripping the flashlight tightly, scanning the area around my campsite. Every shadow seemed darker. Every tree seemed like it was hiding something. I thought about packing up and leaving right then and there, but hiking out in the middle of the night didn't seem like a good idea either. If I panicked and got lost, I'd be in even more danger. So I did the only thing I could think of. I built up the fire again, making it as bright and as big as I could. And then I waited. The hours passed slowly. Every little sound made my heart jump. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the whisper of the wind through the trees. I kept my flashlight on, scanning the darkness every few minutes, trying to catch another glimpse of him. But I never did. Still, I knew he was there. I could feel it. At some point, exhaustion started to creep in. My eyes were heavy, my body sore from sitting so tense for so long. But I refused to sleep. Around 4 a.m., I finally made a decision. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I was leaving. I didn't care about packing up properly. I didn't care about leaving my camping gear behind. I just wanted to get out of there. The fire was starting to die again, but I didn't care anymore. I just sat there, gripping my knife, waiting for dawn. As soon as I saw the first hint of daylight filtering through the trees, I moved. I grabbed my backpack, shoved a few things inside, and left everything else behind. My tent, my cooking gear, even my chair. I didn't look back. I walked fast, almost jogging, my eyes darting from side to side, my ears straining for any sound. And then, just as I reached the edge of the clearing, I made the mistake of glancing over my shoulder one last time. He was there, standing in the exact same spot as before, still watching me. But this time, I saw his face. And what I saw still haunts me. His skin was pale, almost gray, his eyes dark and hollow. His clothes were ragged, torn in places. But the worst part? The way he smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was stretched too wide, unnatural, as if his face didn't quite know how to make the right expression. And then, he took a step toward me. That was it. I ran. I ran faster than I ever have in my life, crashing through the trees, not caring about the noise I made. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I ran until I couldn't breathe, until my legs burned, until I finally saw the distant shimmer of my car parked at the trailhead. I didn't stop running until I was inside, the doors locked, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I drove away as fast as I could. I never went back to that campsite. I never told anyone about what happened, not really. I mentioned seeing something weird out there, but I left out the worst details. Who was he? How long had he been watching me? What would have happened if I had stayed just a little longer? I don't know, and I don't want to know. But one thing is for sure. I'll never camp alone again. The silence, the fresh air, and the freedom of being out in the wilderness, it all made me feel alive. There was something peaceful about being far away from the noise of the city, just me and nature. That's why I picked a remote spot in northern Montana, far from any roads or other campsites. It was late September, the time of year when the leaves turned bright red and orange, and the air was crisp but not too cold. I had hiked deep into the forest earlier that morning, following an old, barely visible trail. The nearest road was at least 15 miles away, and I hadn't seen another person all day. By the time I set up camp near a small clearing, the sun was already sinking behind the trees. It was a perfect place, flat ground, plenty of wood for a fire, and a small stream nearby for water. I spent the last bit of daylight collecting firewood, making sure I had enough to last through the night. When darkness fell, I lit the fire and cooked a simple meal, some canned beans and a few strips of beef jerky. I ate slowly, enjoying the warmth of the flames and the quiet of the forest. It was peaceful. At least, it was at first. It must have been around 9:30 p.m. when I first felt it. That strange feeling, like I wasn't alone. I was leaning back in my camping chair, staring into the fire, when a chill ran down my spine. It wasn't from the cold. It was something else. A deep, instinctive feeling. The kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I slowly looked up and scanned the tree-line. At first, I saw nothing. Just darkness and the shadows of trees swaying slightly in the wind. Then I saw it. A figure. Standing completely still at the edge of the light. I sat up straight, my heart pounding. My first thought was that it might be another camper, maybe a hiker who had gotten lost. But something about the way he stood there, so still, made me uneasy. "Hello," I called out, trying to sound calm. No response. The figure didn't move. He just stood there, watching. I reached for my flashlight, my fingers shaking slightly. I clicked it on and aimed it at the trees. The moment the light hit the spot where the figure had been, he was gone. Vanished. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. Had I imagined it? Was it just a shadow? I told myself that's all it was. Just a trick of the firelight. Just my tired mind playing games with me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I added more wood to the fire, making the flames jump higher, pushing back the darkness as much as I could. I sat there, gripping my flashlight, scanning the trees every few minutes. For a long time, nothing happened. Eventually, I convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe I was just spooked by the isolation. Maybe I was overreacting. I decided to stay up a little longer, just in case. An hour passed. Maybe two. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and my eyes were heavy with sleep. The woods were silent, except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Then I saw it again. Movement. My stomach twisted into a knot. This time, the figure was closer. He was crouched low behind a fallen log, maybe 10 feet from me. I could barely make out his shape in the dim light from the fire. I grabbed my flashlight again and aimed it at the log. Nothing. Just an empty space. No person. No movement. But I knew I had seen him. My breathing was shaky now. My pulse pounded in my ears. I wasn't alone out here. Someone was watching me. Someone was moving closer. I stood up slowly, gripping the flashlight like a weapon, scanning the trees. My mind raced. Was it a hunter? A lost hiker? A dangerous stranger? I thought about packing up and leaving right then and there. But hiking out in the middle of the night didn't seem like a good idea either. If I panicked and got lost, I'd be in even more danger. So I did the only thing I could think of. I built up the fire again, making it as bright and as big as possible. And then I waited. The hours dragged on. Every little sound made me jump. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the whisper of the wind through the trees. I kept scanning the darkness, trying to catch another glimpse of him. But I never saw him again. Still, I knew he was there. I could feel it. At some point, exhaustion crept in. My body was stiff from sitting so tense for so long. My eyelids felt heavy, but I refused to sleep. I checked my watch. Almost 4 a.m. That's when I made up my mind. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I was leaving. I didn't care about packing up properly. I didn't care about leaving my camping gear behind. I just wanted to get out of there. The fire was dying again, but I didn't care. I just sat there, gripping my knife, waiting for dawn. As soon as I saw the first hint of daylight filtering through the trees, I moved. I grabbed my backpack, shoved a few things inside, and left everything else behind: my tent, my cooking gear, even my chair. I didn't look back. I walked fast, almost jogging, my eyes darting from side to side, my ears straining for any sound. And then, just as I reached the edge of the clearing, I made the mistake of glancing over my shoulder one last time. He was there, standing in the exact same spot as before, still watching me. But this time I saw his face, and what I saw still haunts me. His skin was pale, almost gray. His eyes were dark and hollow, empty of any emotion. His clothes were ragged, torn in places. But the worst part was his smile. It wasn't a normal smile. It was stretched too wide, unnatural, as if his face didn't quite know how to make the right expression. And then, he took a step toward me. That was it. I ran. I ran faster than I ever have in my life, crashing through the trees, not caring about the noise I made. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I ran until I saw the distant shimmer of my car parked at the trailhead. I didn't stop running until I was inside, the doors locked, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I drove away as fast as I could. I never went back to that campsite. I never told anyone about what happened, not really. I mentioned seeing something weird out there, but I left out the worst details. Who was he? How long had he been watching me? What would have happened if I had stayed just a little longer? I don't know, and I don't want to know. But one thing is for sure. I'll never camp alone again. Camping alone in the deep woods was something I had done many times before. I liked the peace and quiet, away from people, away from noise, away from everything. It was something I had gotten used to, something that felt almost like a ritual. I would pack my bag, drive as far as I could, then hike deeper into the forest until I found the perfect spot. That night was no different. I had chosen a small clearing by a slow-moving creek. The trees stood tall and thick around the edges, their dark silhouettes blending into the night sky. The place felt secluded, untouched. Exactly how I liked it. By the time I set up my tent and gathered some firewood, the sun was already sinking below the trees. The sky had turned a soft orange, fading into darker shades of purple and blue. The air smelled like damp earth and pine needles. A cool breeze rustled through the trees, making the leaves whisper. I built a fire, its orange glow flickering against the trunks, sending long shadows stretching across the ground. The sound of the creek nearby was steady and calming, a soft background noise that filled the silence. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, some canned beans and a piece of bread. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I ate slowly, watching as the flames danced in the cool night air. The woods around me were alive with the usual sounds: crickets chirping, the occasional rustle of a small animal moving through the underbrush, the hoot of an owl somewhere in the distance. It was peaceful. After a while, I felt tired. I put out most of the fire, leaving only a few glowing embers, then crawled into my tent. Lying on my sleeping bag, I listened to the sounds of the night, letting them lull me to sleep. That's when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Not the quick, light movements of a deer or the scurrying of a raccoon. Two-legged. Human. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The steps were coming from just beyond my tent, moving through the undergrowth. The crunch of leaves. The snap of a twig. Each sound deliberate, controlled, careful. I strained to hear more, my heart hammering. The steps circled my tent. I reached slowly for the knife I always kept nearby, my fingers wrapping around the handle. I held my breath, waiting, listening. The footsteps moved again, closer. Then they stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that feels too heavy, too thick. The crickets had gone quiet. The usual rustling of the night had stilled. It was just me and the sound of my own breathing. I wanted to look. I wanted to unzip the tent and shine my flashlight outside. But I didn't. Something about this felt wrong. I lay there, gripping my knife, my muscles tense. Then nothing. Minutes passed. Maybe an hour. I wasn't sure. I kept listening, waiting for something, anything. But the footsteps didn't come back. Eventually, exhaustion took over. My body was too tired to stay awake, even with fear pressing down on me. I don't remember falling asleep, but at some point, I must have. I woke up to the first light of dawn filtering through the tent. Birds were singing again, the normal morning sounds of the forest returning. For a moment, I just lay there, my mind foggy with sleep. Then I remembered. The footsteps. I sat up quickly, unzipped my tent, and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp and cool, the sky tinged with the soft colors of sunrise. Everything looked normal, but something felt off. I walked around the tent, scanning the ground. The leaves and dirt were disturbed, but not in a way that showed clear footprints. Whoever, or whatever, had been there had moved carefully. Then I saw it. My pile of firewood. I had stacked it neatly the night before, leaving it beside the fire pit. Now it was restacked. Neater. Tighter. As if someone had taken the time to adjust it. I stared at it for a long time, my stomach twisting. Why? Why would someone come to my camp in the middle of the night, walk around my tent, and then fix my firewood pile? I felt exposed, like I had been watched. I didn't waste any more time. I packed up my gear quickly, shoving everything into my backpack with shaking hands. I put out the remaining embers of my fire, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started hiking back the way I had come. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I don't know who, or what, was out there that night, and I don't think I ever want to find out. Mike and I had been best friends since college, and we'd always talked about taking a camping trip together. After years of dreaming and planning, we finally made it happen. We picked a spot in the Appalachian Mountains, far enough from civilization that we wouldn't hear the noise of cars or see the glow of city lights. It was going to be a weekend of hiking, campfires, and stargazing, just two guys reconnecting with nature. The first day went perfectly. We hiked for hours, set up camp in a clearing surrounded by tall pines, and cooked dinner over a small fire. As the sun set, the world around us turned dark and quiet, with only the sounds of the forest filling the air. It was peaceful. We sat by the fire, talking about old memories and making jokes about how neither of us was exactly a survival expert. Mike even tried to scare me with some campfire ghost stories, but they were so ridiculous that we ended up laughing instead. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. I woke up a few hours later. Something felt off. I couldn't tell what it was at first, but then I realized Mike wasn't in his sleeping bag. At first, I thought maybe he had just stepped out to use the bathroom. I waited a few minutes, but he didn't come back. "Mike!" I called out, trying to keep my voice calm. There was no answer. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the cold air hitting me immediately. I scanned the area with my flashlight. Mike's boots were still by the tent, which was strange. Why would he go out barefoot? "Mike, this isn't funny," I shouted. The only response was the rustling of leaves in the wind. I felt a knot of fear forming in my stomach. Mike wasn't the type to wander off without saying something, especially not in the middle of the night. I grabbed my flashlight and started looking for him, calling his name as I went. The forest was unnervingly silent. It was so quiet that I could hear my own breathing and the crunch of my boots on the ground. The beam of my flashlight lit up the trees and bushes, but there was no sign of Mike. I walked farther from the campsite than I intended. I kept telling myself, just a little further, he'll be there. He has to be there. But he wasn't. After what felt like an eternity, I stopped and took a deep breath. That's when I noticed something strange. The forest didn't feel normal anymore. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was oppressive. And then I heard it, a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I stood still, I realized it wasn't. It sounded like a voice, far away and muffled, as if someone was speaking just out of earshot. I turned in the direction of the sound, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Mike!" I called out. The whispering stopped. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I considered running back to the campsite, but I couldn't leave Mike. What if he was hurt? What if he was lost and needed help? I took a step toward where I thought the whisper had come from. Then another. The ground beneath my boots felt soft and uneven, like it hadn't been walked on in years. I found him in a small clearing. He was sitting cross-legged on the ground, facing the woods. His back was to me, and he wasn't moving. "Mike!" I called, relief flooding through me. "What the hell are you doing out here?" He didn't respond. I walked closer, the beam of my flashlight illuminating his hunched shoulders and messy hair. Something was wrong. His posture was stiff, unnatural. "Mike!" I said again, my voice shaking now. Finally, he turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see the side of his face. His eyes were wide and empty, staring into nothing. "It didn't like me leaving," he whispered. His voice sent chills down my spine. It didn't sound like him. It was flat, lifeless, like he was reciting words that weren't his own. "What are you talking about?" Who didn't like you leaving?" I asked, stepping closer. He didn't answer. He just turned his head back toward the woods and started to rock slightly back and forth. I didn't know what to do. My best friend, the guy I'd known for years, was acting like a stranger. I reached out and grabbed his shoulder, trying to shake him out of whatever trance he was in. "Mike, snap out of it. You're scaring me." That's when he started crying. Not normal crying, though. It was this deep, gut-wrenching sob that sounded more like an animal than a person. I didn't know what else to do, so I sat down beside him and waited. Eventually, his crying stopped, and he just sat there, staring into the woods. "We have to go back to the campsite," I said quietly. He didn't move. "Mike, please. We can't stay out here." Finally, he nodded, slowly and reluctantly, like he was being forced to leave something behind. I helped him to his feet, and we made our way back to the tent in silence. The rest of the night was awful. Mike didn't say a word. He just sat by the fire, staring into the flames with that same blank expression. I tried asking him what had happened, but he wouldn't answer. When the sun finally rose, I packed up our gear and told him we were leaving. He didn't argue. He just followed me silently as we made our way back to the trailhead. It's been months since that trip, and Mike still won't talk about what happened. I've asked him a dozen times, but he always changes the subject or says he doesn't remember. But I know he remembers. Sometimes, when I look at him, I catch him staring off into the distance with that same empty look he had in the clearing. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear that faint whisper, as if it's calling me back to the woods. My wife, Sarah, and I had been planning our camping trip to Utah's deserts for months. After years of living in the city, we both needed a break from the noise and the stress. We wanted to feel connected to nature again, to be surrounded by open skies and silence. The desert seemed perfect, a place where we could relax, far from the chaos of everyday life. We arrived at our campsite in the late afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip low in the sky. The landscape was beautiful, red rocks stretching as far as the eye could see, dotted with sparse shrubs and twisted juniper trees. There wasn't another soul in sight. It felt like we had the whole desert to ourselves. We set up our tent on a flat patch of ground near a small outcropping of rocks. As the sun set, we cooked dinner over the campfire and watched the colors of the desert shift from bright orange to deep purple. The sky turned dark, and a blanket of stars appeared, brighter and clearer than we'd ever seen them before. "This is amazing," Sarah said, leaning back in her camping chair and looking up at the sky. "I can't believe how quiet it is out here." I nodded, feeling the same sense of awe. The silence wasn't just peaceful, it was absolute. No cars, no voices, no distant hum of the city. Just the crackle of our fire and the occasional chirp of a cricket. As the night went on, I started to feel a little uneasy. It wasn't anything obvious, just a faint, nagging feeling that I couldn't shake. I didn't want to ruin the moment, so I kept it to myself. Sarah must have felt it too, because after a while she said, "Do you ever get the feeling someone's watching you?" I froze, my stomach tightening. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," she said, glancing over her shoulder. I keep thinking I see something out of the corner of my eye. Like movement. But when I look, there's nothing there." I tried to laugh it off. "You've been watching too many horror movies." She didn't laugh. We decided to call it a night around 11 p.m. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the air had grown cold. We climbed into our tent and zipped it up tight, wrapping ourselves in our sleeping bags. I thought I'd fall asleep easily, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me. Every little noise outside the tent made me jump. Was that the wind? Or something else? At some point, I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, I was wide awake again. Something had woken me up, but I didn't know what. I lay there listening. At first, all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing and Sarah's soft snores. But then, faintly, I heard it, footsteps. My heart started pounding. The sound was faint but unmistakable, slow, deliberate steps, crunching softly on the rocky ground outside. "Sarah," I whispered, shaking her gently. She stirred, groggy and confused. "What's wrong?" "Listen," I said. She sat up, and we both stayed completely still, straining to hear. The footsteps had stopped. "Maybe it's an animal," she whispered. "Maybe," I said, though I didn't believe it. The steps had been too slow, too measured. We waited for what felt like an eternity, but the sound didn't come back. Eventually, Sarah lay back down, though I could tell she was still uneasy. Around 2 a.m., I woke up again. This time, it wasn't footsteps that woke me, it was a feeling. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing on end, and my chest felt tight. I reached for the flashlight we'd left by the sleeping bag and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. The cold night air hit me immediately, but I barely noticed. I shone the flashlight around the campsite, scanning the rocks and shrubs for any sign of movement. At first, I didn't see anything. But then, at the very edge of the light's reach, I saw it. There was a figure standing just beyond the fire pit, where the faint glow of the embers barely illuminated the ground. It was tall and thin, unnaturally so. Its arms hung at its sides, too long to be human. I couldn't make out any features. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel it staring at me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to wake Sarah, but I couldn't move. I couldn't look away from the figure. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, like it was waiting for something. Finally, I managed to whisper, "Sarah." She stirred again, muttering something half asleep. "Sarah, wake up," I said, my voice shaking. She sat up, rubbing her eyes. "What's going on?" I didn't answer. I just pointed the flashlight toward the figure. But when I looked back, it was gone. "What are you pointing at?" she asked, her voice sharp with fear. "There was someone out there," I said, my voice barely audible. Sarah's eyes widened. "What do you mean, someone? Like another camper?" "I don't think so," I said, my throat dry. We spent the rest of the night huddled in the tent, too scared to sleep. Every time we heard a noise outside, we held our breath, waiting for the footsteps to return or for the figure to appear again. When the first light of dawn finally broke, we packed up our gear as fast as we could. We didn't even eat breakfast. We just wanted to get out of there. As we drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing in the middle of the road, watching us leave. It's been years since that night, but I still can't explain what we saw. I've tried convincing myself that it was just a trick of the light or my imagination, but deep down, I know it wasn't. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in the dark, I swear I can still feel those eyes on me. Watching. Waiting. After a tough year, I decided to go on a solo camping trip to the Pacific Northwest. Life had been overwhelming, work, family issues, and constant stress. I needed to clear my head and find some peace. The thought of being alone in nature, surrounded by towering trees and fresh air, was exactly what I needed. I packed my gear and drove for hours until I reached a remote trailhead deep in the forest. The place was beautiful and untouched, far from civilization. It was exactly what I had hoped for. I felt calm for the first time in months. I spent the first day hiking, taking in the sights and sounds of the forest. The trees were massive, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight into soft, golden beams. Birds chirped overhead, and the occasional rustle of leaves reminded me of how alive the woods were. By late afternoon, I found a good spot to set up camp, a small clearing near a gentle stream. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and cooked a simple dinner over the fire. As the sun set and the forest grew dark, I felt a deep sense of relaxation. Little did I know that peace wouldn't last long. That first night was uneventful, and I woke up the next morning feeling refreshed. I spent the day exploring the area, taking pictures, and enjoying the solitude. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was already setting. As night fell, the forest became eerily quiet. The cheerful sounds of birds and rustling leaves were replaced by an oppressive silence. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just my imagination. After all, I was alone in an unfamiliar place. It was normal to feel a little uneasy. I sat by the fire for a while, staring into the flames and letting my mind wander. But that's when I heard it. A voice. At first, it was faint, so faint that I thought I might have imagined it. It sounded like a child calling for help. "Help me." I froze, straining to listen. The voice came again, distant but clear. "Help me." My heart started pounding. Who would be out here, miles from the nearest road or town? And why would a child be alone in the middle of the forest? I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, hesitating for a moment. Every instinct told me to stay put, but the voice was so desperate, so helpless. I couldn't just ignore it. "Hello," I called out. "Is someone there?" There was no response, just the sound of the voice fading deeper into the woods. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow the voice. I told myself that if it really was someone in trouble, I couldn't just leave them. I grabbed my jacket, flashlight, and a small knife, just in case. As I moved deeper into the forest, the voice continued, always just out of reach. "Help me." It sounded like it was coming from a young girl, her tone full of fear. The sound pulled me forward, guiding me through the dark. But something felt off. The voice didn't seem to move naturally. One moment, it would sound close, almost right in front of me. The next, it would be distant, as if it had moved far away in an instant. The farther I went, the stranger the forest became. The trees grew denser, their gnarled branches twisting together like clawed hands. The air felt heavy, damp, and cold. My flashlight's beam seemed weaker, barely piercing the darkness. I started to feel disoriented. I couldn't tell which direction I had come from, and the voice kept leading me deeper and deeper. "Help me." It sounded closer now, almost too close. I stopped in my tracks, scanning the area with my flashlight. But there was no one there. "Hello." I called out again, my voice shaking. Still, there was no response, just the sound of the voice moving farther away once more. I don't know how long I walked. Time felt strange out there, like hours and minutes were blending together. Eventually, I realized I had no idea where I was. My heart sank as I looked around and saw nothing but trees in every direction. Panic began to set in. I called out, but my own voice sounded weak and small. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same. The voice had stopped now, leaving me alone in an oppressive silence. I turned off my flashlight for a moment to save the batteries. That's when I heard it. A rustling sound. It came from behind me, and it was close. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly turned around. "Who's there?" I whispered. The rustling stopped. I shone my flashlight in the direction of the sound, but there was nothing there. Just trees and shadows. I started walking again, this time faster. I didn't care about the voice anymore. I just wanted to get back to my camp. But no matter which way I went, the forest seemed endless. Then I heard the rustling again, this time from my left. I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Stay away," I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. The rustling stopped again, but I felt something watching me. I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see anything. Finally, I saw something, a faint glow in the distance. My heart leapt with hope. It had to be my campfire. I ran toward the light, ignoring the branches that scratched at my arms and face. But as I got closer, the glow disappeared. There was nothing there. That's when I saw the footprints. They were small, like a child's, and they circled around me in the dirt. My blood ran cold. I hadn't seen or heard anyone, but the prints were fresh. I don't remember much after that. I must have wandered for hours, clutching my flashlight and knife, jumping at every sound. Eventually, I stumbled upon my campsite. The fire had long since gone out, and the tent looked untouched. It was as if nothing had happened. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the cold fire pit, gripping my knife and flashlight, waiting for the sun to rise. When morning finally came, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and left. I didn't care about the rest of the trip. I just wanted to get out of that forest. To this day, I don't know what I heard that night. Was it a real person? An animal? Something else? All I know is that I'll never go camping alone again. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I think I can still hear that faint, desperate voice calling from the woods. "Help me." The mountains had always been my favorite place to escape. There was something about the towering peaks, the crisp air, and the endless trails that made me feel alive. I'd hiked most of the trails in the region, but this time I wanted to try something different. A coworker had told me about an old, less-traveled trail deep in the mountains. It wasn't on any maps, but he said it offered the best views and complete solitude. "It's a little tricky to find," he'd warned, "but it's worth it. Just be careful. It's easy to get lost up there." I brushed off his caution. I'd been hiking for years and prided myself on my sense of direction. A remote trail sounded perfect, exactly what I needed to clear my head. I set out early in the morning, the sun just beginning to rise. I parked my car at a small pull-off by the road, shouldered my pack, and started walking. Following the vague directions my coworker had given me, I eventually found the trailhead. It was barely visible, hidden behind thick undergrowth, but I spotted an old wooden signpost leaning at an awkward angle. The letters were faded, but I could just make out the word Summit. The trail was narrow and overgrown, winding through dense forest. I couldn't help but notice how quiet it was. There were no birds singing, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt path. After a few hours of steady climbing, I reached a clearing. The view was breathtaking. The entire valley stretched out below me, the forest a sea of green, with snow-capped peaks rising in the distance. I set my pack down and sat on a rock to catch my breath. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by the trees. She was wearing a red jacket and hiking boots, her long dark hair tied back in a ponytail. "Hello," I called out, waving. She didn't respond. I stood up, feeling a little uneasy. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She finally turned to look at me, but her expression was blank. She didn't look scared or lost, just empty. "Are you lost?" I asked, taking a step toward her. She turned and walked into the trees without a word. I hesitated. Something about the encounter didn't feel right, but I couldn't just ignore her. What if she really was lost? I grabbed my pack and followed her into the woods. The trees were dense here, their branches weaving together to block out most of the sunlight. "Hello," I called out again. "Where are you going?" I caught glimpses of her red jacket through the trees, always just ahead of me. I tried to close the distance, but no matter how fast I walked, I couldn't seem to catch up. The forest grew darker as I went deeper. The air felt heavier, colder. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath and realized I couldn't hear her footsteps anymore. "Hey, are you there?" I shouted, my voice echoing. There was no reply. I turned in a slow circle, trying to get my bearings. The trail was gone, replaced by uneven ground and tangled roots. I realized with a sinking feeling that I had no idea where I was. I tried to backtrack, but everything looked the same. The trees seemed to close in around me, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal arms. My heart was racing now, panic creeping in. Then I saw her again. She was standing about 20 feet away, her back to me. Her red jacket stood out starkly against the dark trees. "Wait!" I shouted, running toward her. She turned her head slightly, just enough for me to see the side of her face. Her eyes were wide, unblinking. "Why are you following me?" she whispered. Her voice was soft but clear, and it sent chills down my spine. Before I could respond, she turned and walked deeper into the forest. I didn't want to follow her anymore. Everything about this felt wrong, but I couldn't just leave her out here. What if she was in trouble? Against my better judgment, I kept going. The deeper I went, the stranger the forest became. The trees looked twisted, their bark peeling in long, jagged strips. The air was so cold now that I could see my breath. I lost sight of her again, but I could hear her voice, faint and distant. "This way." It wasn't a plea or a call for help. It sounded almost teasing. I don't know how long I wandered. Time felt distorted, like hours and minutes were blending together. I kept thinking I saw her out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing there. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping sound, like someone drumming their fingers against a tree trunk. It was close, too close. I spun around, shining my flashlight in every direction, but I didn't see anything. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The tapping stopped. I was completely lost now, both physically and mentally. My legs were shaking, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I needed to find a way out, but every direction looked the same. Then I saw the red jacket again, hanging from a low branch. It looked old, the fabric faded and torn, as if it had been there for years. Beneath it was a small pile of stones, carefully stacked like a marker. I didn't understand what I was looking at, but it filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. The forest seemed endless, the trees blurring together as I stumbled over roots and rocks. Eventually, I broke through the tree-line and found myself back on the trail. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, tears streaming down my face. When I looked up, I saw my car in the distance. Somehow, I had made it back to the trailhead. I don't remember the drive home. My mind was a blur, replaying everything I had seen and heard. I told a few close friends about the experience, but they all said the same thing. I must have imagined it, or maybe I had gotten dehydrated and disoriented. But I know what I saw. And sometimes, late at night, I dream about her, the girl in the red jacket, standing at the edge of the clearing, her empty eyes staring right through me. For as long as I could remember, I had loved the outdoors. Camping trips, hiking, fishing. I craved the peace that came from being surrounded by nature. So when my old college friends, Mark and Jenna, invited me to join them on a weekend camping trip. I couldn't say no. The location was remote, deep in the Appalachian Mountains. Mark said he'd found it on a forum for serious hikers. A hidden gem, he called it. The place was off the beaten path, completely secluded. Perfect, I thought. I packed my gear and met them at the trailhead on a Friday afternoon. The weather was perfect, clear skies, a cool breeze, and the promise of a beautiful weekend. We started our hike, the trail winding through dense woods and up steep inclines. The further we went, the more I felt like we were stepping into another world. The trees were massive, their thick branches creating a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. It was beautiful, but there was something about the silence that felt heavy. After several hours, we reached a small clearing by a creek and decided to set up camp. It was a peaceful spot, surrounded by trees, with the sound of water trickling over rocks nearby. We pitched our tents, built a fire, and settled in for the evening. As the sun set, the forest grew darker than I expected. The canopy above let in almost no moonlight, and the shadows around our campfire seemed to stretch endlessly. Mark was the first to comment on it. "It's weird how dark it gets out here," he said, poking at the fire with a stick. "Even with the fire, it feels like the shadows are closer." Jenna laughed nervously. "Don't start with that creepy stuff," she said. "I'm already on edge." I chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. "It's just the woods. Shadows always seem bigger out here." But deep down, I felt it too, that strange sense that the darkness was pressing in, watching us. We stayed up late, talking and joking, trying to ignore the eerie atmosphere. Eventually, we crawled into our tents, the fire reduced to glowing embers. I was tired from the hike and expected to fall asleep quickly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I lay there, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was quiet, too quiet. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just silence. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound like someone, or something, moving through the underbrush. I sat up, my heart racing. "Mark, Jenna," I called out softly. "Yeah." Mark's voice came from the next tent. "Did you hear that?" There was a pause, then, "Probably just an animal." Jenna spoke up, her voice shaky. It sounded close. We sat in silence for a few moments, listening. The rustling stopped, and the forest went silent again. "Let's just get some sleep," Mark said, though I could hear the unease in his voice. I eventually drifted off, but it wasn't a restful sleep. I kept waking up, feeling like someone was standing just outside my tent. Every time I looked, there was nothing there. The next morning, Jenna looked exhausted. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted as we ate breakfast. "I kept hearing, I don't know, footsteps or something." Mark shrugged it off. "It's the woods. Animals move around at night. It's normal." I wanted to believe him, but the look on Jenna's face told me she didn't buy it either. We spent the day exploring the area, hiking up a nearby ridge for a better view. The scenery was stunning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every so often, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of shadow or a branch swaying when there was no wind. At one point, Jenna stopped suddenly, her eyes wide. "What's wrong?" I asked. She pointed to the ground. "Look." There were footprints in the dirt, bare, human footprints. They were larger than any of ours and looked fresh, like they had just been made. Mark tried to laugh it off. "Probably another hiker. Who hikes out here without shoes?" Jenna shot back. None of us had an answer. That night, the unease only grew. We sat around the fire again, trying to keep things light, but the silence of the forest was oppressive. "I feel like we're not alone out here," Jenna said quietly. Mark rolled his eyes. "You're letting your imagination get to you." But I agreed with her. I hadn't said anything, but I felt it too, that sense of being watched, like the shadows themselves were alive. After we went to bed, the real terror began. I woke up to the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, circling our campsite. My heart was pounding as I lay there, frozen, listening. The footsteps stopped near my tent, and I could hear breathing, slow and shallow, like someone was standing right outside. "Mark," I whispered, my voice barely audible. There was no response. I gathered my courage and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. My flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. I crawled out, trembling, and shone the light around the campsite. Jenna's and Mark's tents were zipped up tight, and the fire had died completely. The shadows were deeper than ever, pooling around the trees like ink. Then I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, standing at the edge of the clearing. It was just barely visible, its form blending with the shadows. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move. Mark and Jenna scrambled out of their tents, startled by my shouting. "What's going on?" Mark asked, rubbing his eyes. "There's someone out there," I said, pointing toward the trees. They looked, but the figure was gone. "Are you sure?" Jenna asked, her voice trembling. "I know what I saw," I insisted. We stayed up the rest of the night, huddled by the fire, weapons in hand, Mark with his hunting knife, me with a heavy branch I'd grabbed. When dawn finally came, we packed up and left in a hurry. None of us spoke much on the hike back to the car. The forest felt different in the daylight, less menacing, but the sense of being watched never left. As we loaded our gear into the car, I glanced back toward the trailhead. For just a moment, I thought I saw the figure again, standing among the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone. We never talked about that trip again. I stopped going into the mountains after that, and I know Mark and Jenna did too. To this day, I don't know what we encountered out there. But sometimes late at night, I think about those shadows and the figure that seemed to rise out of them. And I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for the next group of campers to wander too far into its domain. Camping had always been my go-to escape when life got too loud. I loved the simplicity of it, setting up a tent, cooking over a fire, and falling asleep under the stars. So when a long weekend came around, I decided to take a solo trip to a forested area I had visited years ago. It wasn't a well-known spot, which was perfect. I wanted peace, not the hum of fellow campers or the distant buzz of nearby highways. This place was tucked away, miles from the nearest town. I loaded my gear, picked up a few snacks, and headed out early in the morning. The drive was uneventful, though the roads became narrower and bumpier the closer I got to the trailhead. By the time I arrived, the sun was high, and the dense forest stretched out before me like a green sea. I parked my car on a patch of gravel, grabbed my backpack, and started the hike to my chosen campsite. The trail wound through tall pines and thick undergrowth. Sunlight filtered through the branches in patches, casting shadows that danced with the breeze. It was quiet, almost too quiet. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt path. I shrugged it off. Sometimes the forest was like that. After about 2 hours of hiking, I reached a clearing beside a small creek. The spot was perfect. Flat ground for my tent, access to fresh water, and a decent view of the surrounding trees. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and sat down to enjoy the stillness. The day passed peacefully. I spent the afternoon reading, exploring the nearby area, and enjoying the solitude. As the sun began to set, I lit a small fire and cooked a simple meal. That's when I first heard it. It was faint at first, so faint I thought I had imagined it. A soft, high-pitched laugh, like that of a child, carried on the wind. I froze, listening intently. The sound didn't come again, and the forest remained silent. I shook my head and chuckled nervously. Maybe I was just hearing things. But deep down, I felt uneasy. The sun dipped below the horizon, and darkness swallowed the forest. My fire crackled, the only source of light and warmth in the encroaching night. I sat close to it, the shadows around me growing darker and thicker with each passing minute. Then I heard it again. This time, it was louder, unmistakable, a soft, giggling laugh, coming from somewhere beyond the firelight. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. There was no response, just the sound of the creek and the crackling fire. I told myself it must be the wind or some strange animal call, but the laugh was so human, so deliberate, that I couldn't fully convince myself. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing only trunks and branches. "Is someone there?" I asked, louder this time. The laugh came again, this time from a different direction, behind me. I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my hand, but there was nothing there. My heart was racing now. I sat back down by the fire, gripping the flashlight tightly. The night dragged on, the laughter coming and going. Sometimes it was faint, almost playful, like a child playing hide and seek. Other times it was louder, closer, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there was circling my campsite. I barely slept, every sound setting me on edge. When dawn finally broke, I felt a wave of relief. The sunlight chased away the shadows, and the forest felt less menacing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I spent the morning debating whether to pack up and leave, but I convinced myself to stay. Maybe I was just overreacting. It had been a long day, and my imagination had gotten the better of me. The second day passed much like the first, though I couldn't fully relax. Every time I ventured too far from the campsite, I felt like I was being watched. By the time night fell, I was on edge. I built the fire higher, its warm glow pushing back the darkness. But the laughter returned. This time, it started earlier, before the forest was fully dark. I was sitting by the fire when I heard it, soft, distant, but unmistakable. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound brave. The laughter didn't stop. It grew louder, moving through the trees like it was taunting me. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, my hands shaking. "If someone's out there, this isn't funny." The laughter stopped abruptly, plunging the forest into silence. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then I heard a voice. "Why are you afraid?" The voice was soft, almost childlike, but there was something wrong about it, something hollow, like it didn't belong. I shone my flashlight into the trees, my heart pounding. "Show yourself." A figure stepped out from the shadows. It was small, about the size of a child, and its outline was blurry, like it didn't fully belong in this world. It stood there, staring at me with dark, empty eyes. Then it smiled, its mouth stretching impossibly wide. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. When I looked up again, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, clutching my knife, waiting for the sun to rise. The laughter came and went, always just out of reach, echoing through the trees. When dawn finally broke, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. I didn't care about breakfast or the trail. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back to the car felt endless. Every rustling leaf and snapping twig made me jump, convinced that something was following me. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car, I nearly cried with relief. I threw my gear into the trunk and got in, locking the doors before starting the engine. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a moment, I thought I saw something standing at the edge of the forest, a small figure, smiling, watching me leave. I haven't been camping since that trip. The forest, once my refuge, now feels like a place I can never return to. And sometimes late at night, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear that laugh again, soft, teasing, and just beyond the edge of the light. I never liked camping much, but I had convinced myself this trip would be different. It was supposed to be a weekend of solitude, a break from the constant noise of city life. I had picked a remote spot deep in the national forest, far from any designated camping areas. A place where I wouldn't see another person for miles. That was the plan. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun beginning its slow descent behind the trees. The air smelled fresh, untouched, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The trail leading to the spot I had chosen was barely visible, more of a deer path than a real trail. It was rugged, winding through dense foliage, up a slight incline before leveling off into a clearing. The spot was perfect. A flat piece of land surrounded by tall trees, with a small stream trickling nearby. I set my gear down and took a deep breath. No traffic, no voices, no hum of electronics. Just the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of birds. I started setting up my tent immediately. The sun was dipping lower, and I didn't want to fumble with it in the dark. The ground was firm but manageable, and I drove the stakes deep, securing the fabric against any wind that might pick up later. Once the tent was up, I gathered firewood. Most of it was damp, but I found enough dry pieces under fallen logs. I stacked them carefully and pulled out my fire starter. It took a few minutes, but soon enough, flames flickered to life, casting long shadows across the clearing. I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal from my pack. The quiet was nice. I had spent weeks looking forward to this trip, planning it down to the last detail. But as the last traces of daylight faded, a sense of unease settled over me. It was irrational. I had camped before, though never this deep into the woods. But something about the darkness pressing in from all sides felt different. I forced myself to ignore it. I finished eating, cleaned up my small campsite, and tossed some more wood onto the fire. I didn't want to go to sleep yet. The fire was comforting, its light keeping the blackness at bay. Then I heard it, a sound in the distance. Faint, barely audible over the crackling flames. A rustling, maybe an animal moving through the underbrush. Probably a deer. I kept still, listening. The sound stopped. Just the wind, I told myself. Or a rabbit. Maybe even a raccoon. But a few minutes later, it came again. Closer this time. A distinct shuffling noise. Not the quick scurry of a small animal, but something larger, heavier. I reached for my flashlight and aimed it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trunks and branches, but nothing else. I swept the light slowly, searching. Nothing. I turned it off and sat back, my heart beating faster than before. It was nothing, just the usual sounds of the forest. I had chosen a remote location. Of course, there were animals around, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I stayed up late, staring into the fire, listening. The noises didn't come back. Eventually, I convinced myself I was being paranoid and crawled into my tent. I zipped it up tight, even though I knew it wouldn't keep anything out. Lying there, wrapped in my sleeping bag, I listened. The night was silent except for the occasional crackle of the fire outside. I forced myself to close my eyes. At some point, I drifted off. Then something woke me. A sound. Close. I held my breath, ears straining. The fire had burned low, its glow barely reaching the tent. And then I heard it again. Footsteps. Right outside. Slow. Deliberate. My stomach twisted into knots. My mind raced. A bear. A person. No one should be out here. This spot was miles from the nearest campsite. I stayed completely still. The footsteps stopped. I listened, barely breathing. Nothing. Minutes passed. Then scraping. Right against the tent fabric. I felt my chest tighten. Someone was right outside. I didn't move. Didn't make a sound. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the sound stopped. The footsteps retreated, fading into the trees. I stayed frozen in place for what felt like an eternity. When I finally found the courage to move, I reached for my knife. I gripped it tight, every muscle tense. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there, waiting for the first light of dawn. When morning finally came, I unzipped the tent slowly, peering out. The fire was nothing but ashes, and my surroundings looked the same as before. But then I saw them. Footprints. Human, leading from the trees to my tent. Then away again. I packed up immediately. My hands shook as I stuffed my gear into my pack. I kept my knife within reach, scanning the trees constantly. The hike back to my car felt longer than before. Every snap of a twig made my pulse jump. I didn't stop. I didn't rest. I just kept walking, fast but steady, until I saw my car through the trees. When I finally locked myself inside, I exhaled for the first time in hours. My hands were still shaking. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing. I'm never camping alone again. I had planned the trip for months. A solo camping weekend deep in the forest, away from people, noise, and responsibilities. It was supposed to be a test for myself, a chance to disconnect from the world and rely only on what I carried. The location was chosen carefully, a remote area in a national forest, miles from any designated campsites. It was off the beaten path, requiring a long hike through thick trees and uneven ground. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive to the trailhead took most of the morning. I arrived just after noon, parked my truck at the small, nearly abandoned lot, and double-checked my gear. Everything was packed tightly in my backpack. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water, knife, flashlight, extra batteries. Enough supplies to last me 2 nights. The hike-in was exhausting but peaceful. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. The trail was barely a trail at all, just a narrow, winding path through thick underbrush and towering trees. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of damp earth and pine. After a few hours, I reached my spot, a small clearing near a shallow creek. The trees stood tall and dense around it, blocking most of the sky. The ground was dry, covered in fallen leaves and pine needles. I set down my pack and stretched, my muscles aching from the hike. I had at least 2 hours of daylight left, enough time to set up camp and gather wood. I pitched my tent first, making sure it was secured against the uneven ground. It was a small one-person tent, just big enough for me and my gear. Once it was up, I unrolled my sleeping bag inside, then went to work collecting firewood. Most of the fallen branches were damp, but I found enough dry ones under thicker logs. I stacked them neatly by the fire pit I made from rocks, then used my lighter to get a flame going. It took some effort, but soon a small fire crackled to life, casting a soft glow over the clearing. As the sun dipped lower, the forest around me darkened. The deep greens of the trees turned into silhouettes, blending together in the fading light. The air grew colder, and the sounds of the forest changed, birds quieting down, insects taking their place. I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal from my pack. The warmth of the flames was comforting, pushing back the encroaching darkness. Then a sound, distant but distinct, a rustling in the underbrush. I stopped chewing and listened. Probably an animal, a deer or a raccoon. It wasn't uncommon for wildlife to move around at dusk, but something about it felt off. The sound wasn't quick, like a startled animal darting through the woods. It was slow, measured, a careful movement. I turned my flashlight toward the trees, sweeping the beam back and forth. The light bounced off trunks and branches, but nothing else. The sound had stopped. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. The woods were full of sounds, twigs snapping, leaves shifting in the wind. I forced myself to relax and focused on the fire. The flames flickered and danced, casting long shadows behind me. Time passed. The night settled in. Then another sound. Closer. A branch breaking. Not a small twig, a thick, solid snap. Something was there. My body tensed. I turned my flashlight toward the trees again, my pulse hammering. Still nothing. I stared into the darkness, straining my ears. Silence. I kept the flashlight aimed at the trees for a long time before finally lowering it. The firelight flickered, making shadows shift and dance. I took a deep breath. Maybe a falling branch. Maybe an animal stepping on old wood. I didn't like how uneasy I felt. I decided to stay up a little longer. I fed the fire more wood, keeping the flames high. The warmth felt like a shield, keeping the darkness at bay. I listened. Nothing. After another hour, exhaustion crept in. I needed sleep. I secured my food, made sure the fire was contained, and crawled into my tent. I zipped it up tight, my flashlight within reach. I lay still, listening. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional crackle of the fire outside. I closed my eyes. Then something moved. Right outside my tent. A slow, deliberate step. I stopped breathing. The fire was still burning. Any animal would avoid it. Another step. Closer. My skin went cold. I gripped my knife, my fingers wrapped so tightly around the handle they ached. Whatever was out there was standing just outside. The fabric of the tent shifted, something touching it. I stayed completely still. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my throat. Then silence. Minutes passed. Then the footsteps retreated. Slowly. Moving away. I lay there for what felt like hours, knife clutched in my hand, every muscle in my body locked. I didn't sleep. Morning came slowly. The first light of dawn filtered through the tent fabric. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. I unzipped the tent carefully, scanning the campsite. Everything looked the same. But then I saw them. Footprints. Human. Leading from the trees to my tent. Then away. I packed up in minutes. Every sound in the forest made my nerves spike. I moved fast, stuffing everything into my pack, my hands shaking. The hike back felt longer. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something, or someone following me. When I finally reached my truck, I locked the doors the second I got inside. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my breath coming fast. I didn't know who had been out there. I didn't want to know. But I knew one thing. I was never camping alone again. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A weekend away from everything, just me, my gear, and the quiet of nature. I had picked a small, remote campground deep in the forest, one that wasn't too well known. Fewer people meant fewer distractions. I wanted to clear my mind, get some fresh air, and reset. The drive took longer than expected. The last few miles were rough, the road narrowing into a twisting path of dirt and gravel. Tall trees lined both sides, their branches stretching overhead, blocking out most of the sky. My GPS had lost signal a while back, but I wasn't too worried. I had the directions saved. When I finally arrived, the place looked almost abandoned. The sign at the entrance was old, the paint faded and peeling. The small wooden booth that should have had a ranger inside was empty. A laminated map was pinned to a board next to it, showing the layout of the campground. There were only 10 sites, scattered far apart from each other, with a single dirt road looping through the area. I drove in slowly, passing a few empty sites. No cars, no tents. The place was completely deserted. That should have been my first sign to turn back. But I didn't. I found my spot, campsite number 7, near the back of the loop, close to a small trail leading into the woods. I parked, shut off the engine, and stepped out. The air was cool and still. The only sounds were the faint rustling of leaves and the distant chirp of birds. I stood there for a moment, taking it in. It felt off. Not wrong, just off. I shook the feeling away and got to work. I set up my tent near the fire pit, making sure it was secure. The ground was firm but covered in a thick layer of dry leaves. I gathered some firewood from the surrounding area, stacking it neatly. As the sun dipped lower, the forest changed. The light faded fast, shadows stretching long between the trees. The air grew colder. I started a fire. The flames crackled, pushing back the darkness. I sat on the small folding chair I had brought, eating a quick meal from my pack. The fire was warm, the glow comforting. Then I noticed something. A noise. Not close, but not far either. A steady thunk, 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 like wood being chopped. It came from somewhere beyond the trees, past the trail near my sight. I frowned. I hadn't seen any other cars. No signs of campers. But someone was out there. I listened for a while, waiting for it to stop. It didn't. I told myself it was just another camper, someone setting up late. Maybe they had hiked in instead of driving. Still, something about it unsettled me. The rhythm never changed. It wasn't fast, not hurried, just steady. A slow, deliberate swing of an axe or a hatchet. I kept the fire going and stayed close to it. Eventually, after what felt like an hour, the chopping stopped. Silence settled over the forest again. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I checked the time. It was late. I needed rest. I made sure everything was in place, food packed away, fire contained, then climbed into my tent. I zipped it up tight, my knife and flashlight within reach. I lay there, staring at the fabric ceiling, listening. Nothing. The fire outside crackled softly. I closed my eyes. Then, somewhere in the distance, closer than before, came the sound of footsteps. Not an animal. Not scattered or uncertain. Slow. Steady. Coming from the direction of the trail. My grip on the knife tightened. I didn't move. The footsteps stopped. Minutes passed. Then, something moved outside my tent. Not walking. Standing. Waiting. I held my breath. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then, just as suddenly, the footsteps retreated. Back down the trail. I stayed awake the rest of the night, knife in hand, staring at the tent walls. Morning came slowly. When I finally unzipped the tent, the campsite looked normal. The fire had died down, the woods were quiet. But near the edge of my sight, leading from the trail to my tent and back again, footprints. Large. Deep. Not boots. Bare feet. I packed up and left immediately. I didn't look back. I had planned this solo camping trip for weeks. I wanted to get away from everything, work, noise, people. I had camped alone before, but never this deep in the woods. This time, I wanted real isolation. No designated campsites, no neighbors in RVs, no sounds of distant conversations. Just me and the forest. I picked a remote section of a national forest, far off the usual trails. The kind of place where you wouldn't run into another person unless they were looking for you specifically. It took most of the afternoon to hike in, my pack heavy with supplies. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. The only sounds were my boots crunching over leaves and the occasional bird call. It felt peaceful at first. After a few miles, I found a good spot. A small clearing near a stream, flat ground, surrounded by tall trees. It was perfect. I set up my tent, making sure the stakes were deep. I unrolled my sleeping bag inside, then gathered firewood from the surrounding area. The sun was getting low, and I didn't want to be scrambling in the dark. By the time I got the fire going, the light was fading. The flames cast flickering shadows, pushing back the darkness. I sat down, ate a quick meal, and let the warmth of the fire sink in. That's when I noticed it. The silence. Not just quiet, absolute silence. No wind. No rustling leaves. No distant chirping. The forest had gone completely still. I told myself it was normal. Animals quiet down at night. But something about it felt wrong. I tried to ignore it and focused on the fire. The flames crackled, the warmth comforting. But the feeling didn't go away. It pressed on me, heavy and suffocating. Then I heard it. A sound, distant but distinct. Footsteps. Not the quick, skittering sounds of an animal. These were slow, deliberate. I turned my head, listening. The sound came from the trees beyond the fire's glow. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the noise. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trunks and branches, but nothing else. I held still, listening. Nothing. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. The forest was full of noises. Twigs snapping, branches shifting. I forced myself to relax. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stayed up late, staring into the fire, listening. The footsteps didn't come back. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I checked my gear, secured my food, and crawled into my tent. I zipped it up tight, my knife within reach. I lay there, ears straining for any sound. For a long time, there was nothing. Then, a soft rustling. Close. Right outside my tent. I stopped breathing. My body went rigid. The fire was still burning outside. No animal would come this close. Then a slow, deliberate step. Right next to the tent. The fabric shifted slightly, as if something or someone was touching it. My fingers wrapped around my knife. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then silence. Minutes passed. My body ached from staying still. Then, the footsteps moved away. Slow, unhurried, fading into the trees. I didn't move. I stayed like that for hours, knife clutched in my hand, eyes locked on the tent walls. At some point, dawn arrived. The fire had burned down to embers. The forest looked normal. But near my tent, leading from the trees and back again, footprints. Human. I packed up immediately. My hands shook as I stuffed everything into my bag. I kept my knife out, scanning the trees constantly. The hike back to my truck felt endless. Every sound made my pulse spike. When I finally reached my truck, I locked the doors the second I got inside. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, heart still racing. I don't know who was out there. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. I'm never camping alone again. I was 16 when I went on that camping trip. I barely knew the people I was with. They were all older, between 19 and 21, and I had only met a couple of them a few times before. It wasn't really my idea to go, but I wanted to get out of town for a few days. I figured camping would be fun, just a couple of nights in the woods, drinking, hanging out, maybe hiking a little. Nothing serious. The campground was way out in rural Oregon, miles from any real road. It wasn't an official site, just a clearing in the woods that some of the older guys knew about. They had camped there before, and they swore no one else ever went out that far. That's what they liked about it. No rangers, no rules, no other campers. The guy who drove us, Kyle, was 21 and had the only car. It was an old beat-up sedan, barely running. He was loud, cocky, always trying to be the center of attention. His girlfriend, Lisa, was 19, and the trip was partly her idea. The others, Dan, Matt, and Eric, were all around 20 and had known each other for years. I was the outsider, tagging along because I had nothing better to do. The drive out took forever. The paved roads turned into gravel, then dirt, then nothing more than a rough trail cutting through the trees. Kyle loved showing off, speeding down the narrow path, making the car bounce over the ruts. Branches scraped the sides, and more than once, I thought we were going to get stuck. But somehow we made it. The campsite was just a small clearing surrounded by thick woods. There was a fire pit in the center, probably from previous trips. A creek ran nearby, shallow and cold, the water moving lazily over smooth rocks. It was a nice spot, quiet, isolated. Too isolated. We set up our tents while Kyle and Lisa started drinking. The rest of us followed. As the night went on, people got louder, the fire got bigger, and everything blurred together. The first night wasn't bad. I stayed mostly quiet, listening to the others joke around and talk about people I didn't know. The fire burned down late, and we all crawled into our tents. The second day was when things went wrong. It started when Kyle got jealous. Lisa had been talking to Dan a lot, laughing, leaning a little too close. Kyle noticed. His mood shifted fast. 1 minute, he was fine. The next, he was fuming. By mid-afternoon, they were fighting. It was bad. The kind of fight where you know someone's going to say something they can't take back. Then Kyle just snapped. He stormed off toward his car, Lisa yelling after him. He got in, started the engine, and before anyone could stop him, he was gone. We all stood there, watching the dust settle on the empty road. At first, no one panicked. We figured he'd cool off and come back. He wouldn't just leave us here. Would he? We spent the rest of the day waiting. It got dark. No sign of Kyle. We told ourselves he'd be back in the morning. He wasn't. By the third day, things got serious. We were out of food. The little water we had left came from the creek, but it tasted weird, like dirt and leaves. The mood had changed completely. No more joking, no more laughing. Just frustration, hunger, and the realization that we were truly stranded. We were at least 10 miles from the nearest road, and none of us were sure which direction to go. We argued about whether we should try to hike out or stay put. What if Kyle came back? What if someone else found us? The third night was the worst. No fire, no food, just cold air and the sound of the wind moving through the trees. Every noise made me jump. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the distant call of some animal I couldn't identify. Sleep was impossible. I lay in my tent, stomach aching, heart pounding. Every hour felt like a lifetime. By morning, we were desperate. That's when we heard it, an engine, a truck. We ran toward the sound, stumbling over rocks and roots. A family had pulled into the clearing, a dad, a mom, 2 kids. We must have looked like hell. Dirty, exhausted, starving. They didn't hesitate. They drove a couple of us to the nearest town, where we finally got a phone and called for help. By the end of the day, we were all picked up, our gear left behind. I never saw any of them again. Never wanted to. That trip changed something in me. I never camped the same way again. I never trusted people the same way again. And I never, ever went anywhere without a way to get back home.